Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on wherever you are, to our friends and our colleagues and attendees around the globe. I'm Glenn Hubbard, and it's really my distinct pleasure and privilege to welcome all of you today as we celebrate what's truly an important milestone in Columbia Business School's history, the 30th anniversary of the Jerome A. Chazen Institute of Global Business. And what better way to recognize the Institute and its founder and visionary, Jerry Chazen, than to host an event that's both looking forward and looking backward at the challenges and opportunities of globalization. I can't think of a better take than Jerry's own words.
When we founded Liz Claiborne, we became a rather rapid success. It was obvious that we could not find sufficient factory space in this country to make all of the garments we needed at the price and quality level that we had established our company to be. And I suggested to the company that we should consider having goods made overseas. And I thought Liz would have a heart attack. And she said, "We can't manage factories that we have in New Jersey. And here you want to make stuff 10,000 miles away?" She said, "Never, never." And we gave him a very kind of a difficult blouse to make that we were having a very tough time getting made in this country. And the merchandise came back from Hong Kong, and it was beautiful. She couldn't believe it. And much cheaper than we could have made it in this country. And so that was the beginning. And within a year, we were 100% overseas.
For 30 years, the Chazen Institute has really coordinated all of Columbia Business School's major global programs, its activities and resources. And just to provide you with flavor, our work at the school includes providing support for faculty and PhD research at a financial level for critical global business issues. So think things like global supply chains, what's next, who pays actually for US-China tariffs, hint we do, future of the World Trade Organization, global tax and antitrust challenges. Preparing MBA students is also a big part of our role, preparing them to be leaders in a truly global marketplace by providing on-the-ground travel experiences that enable them to observe firsthand other countries' business environments and cultures. We also provide language training, visiting scholar programs, and exchange programs that enable students to spend a semester at a distinguished school outside the United States. More than 10,000 students have been on Chazen global study trips, all led by faculty experts. And organizing events like this one that serve as a meeting place for scholars and for business leaders to analyze and hopefully anticipate global business challenges. Columbia and the Institute have convening power, and at the Institute, we're not shy about using that. Over the years, the Institute's work has crossed the globe many, many times over. Among other activities, we've hosted regional conferences in China and India and Latin America, engaging local business executives, policymakers, and academics in deep conversations and debate across pressing global topics and business challenges. We've worked with companies all over the world and across business sectors to produce case studies that enhance our students' critical skills. We've collaborated and secured partnerships with institutions across industries and disciplines in both industrial and emerging economies to advance our educational mission, whether it's through global consulting projects with multinational organizations, or ventures or projects or executive education training programs with budding and seasoned entrepreneurs in Africa and throughout Latin America. We've disseminated our e-newsletter, our research briefs in more than 70 countries. Now, perhaps it's fitting in these unprecedented times that we convene this conference and we come together in a virtual environment. The pandemic has posed new challenges, but it's also reinforced some familiar ones. The Chazen Institute is committed to addressing both the challenges and the opportunities of globalization. When the Chazen Institute was founded 30 years ago, policymakers largely pursued an outside in view of globalization. That is a view where the rules of globalization's game were given, and the domestic economy, its workers, its firms, its industries simply had to adjust. While that view did support growth on average, it did look past many people left behind and fan flames of destructive populism. At the Institute, we've also been examining and analyzing an inside out view that embraces globalization, but also pursues policies that build broader domestic support for it. That's nothing more than the mass flourishing urged on us by Adam Smith. Today's conference and our time together brings all of us from a truly global community representing 2,800 registrants from more than 60 countries, from Algeria and Argentina to Vietnam and Zambia, Columbia Business School alumni from the class of 1950 to current students across all of our degree programs, faculty, staff, colleagues, and friends across numerous academic disciplines and industry sectors. We also thankfully recognize support from Columbia University's 9 global centers. And we welcome all of today's speakers and contributors, some of the most prominent figures in academia, in industry, and in policymaking. Now, finally, in true celebratory fashion, I'd be remiss if we all didn't wish Jerry Chazen a very happy birthday and thank him for his years of leadership, his generosity, his service. We look forward to many more. So without further ado, welcome to Globalization. Where do we go from here? Away we go.
Globalization is the adoption of a global mindset to solve universal problems that all of us face, that humanity faces, whether that is climate change, whether that is technology and cybersecurity and misinformation, or whether it's the global pandemic.
Globalization is often misunderstood. People look at what actually happens in a country due to lack of good policies, lack of redistribution, lack of a social safety net, and they think these are the necessary outcomes of globalization. So globalization is not a panacea by itself, but globalization certainly has the potential to make the pie bigger in all countries that participate in it.
Globalization is an economic opportunity for lower skilled workers in developing countries, and without redistribution, an economic hardship for those in wealthier ones.
It's a treat for me to begin with a conversation with two of the universities and the world's leading thinkers on globalization. Two of my colleagues at the business school and in the economics community at Columbia. The first is Joseph Stiglitz, who's a Nobel Laureate in economics and a university professor at Columbia, a giant in virtually every field in economics, but here in particular in information economics and public economics. He's also joined by Bruce Greenwald, who is the Heilbron Professor of Asset Management Emeritus at Columbia Business School and a leader in thought and in practice in value investing. These two gentlemen together have taught for years an extremely popular course in Columbia University on globalization, so it's great to bring them together. As we have our conversation, remember that you too can be submitting questions, and I'll fold them into the conversation with Bruce and with Joe. So good morning, or afternoon or evening, and from the perspective of others watching, I want to dive right in, if I might. Is globalization dead, Joe?
No, it's clearly not. We have a number of problems that can only be solved by globalization, like climate change. The pandemic was a global problem. And it is still the case that their comparative advantage is important, and global trade is important in raising living standards. So the question is not whether globalization is alive, but how we're going to manage it in the much more complex geopolitics of today's world.
Bruce, what do you think? Looks like we're having a moment of trouble connecting to Bruce. So, Joe, let me follow up on what you said when you said how to manage it. Are you referring to the U.S.-China relations, other kinds of global coordination issues? What's most on your mind?
Well, what's most on my mind is the China US issues. There are also global issues having to do with the tech giants, where and the issues of privacy, security that we're also having with Europe. And over the last 4 years, we had our allies, Canada and Europe. I think the latter, our trade relations with Europe, are easily solved. There's a commonality of understanding about what reasonable economics, not perfect, but what reasonable policy is. The issue with China are the ones that are going to be most complex. And even with Europe, the issues over the tech sector and security are going to be very complex.
Let me press you a bit on the U.S.-China front. And I see we now have Bruce. Bruce, do you want to go back and tell me, is globalization dead?
Well, I mean, on what you think globalization is or was. So if you take the view that it was this absolutely overwhelming force, I don't think it was ever alive. And to give you a feel for what that means, when it first became sort of the center of economic discussion, the idea was that every firm was going to be struggling for survival in a global market. Profits were going to go away, and it was just going to be an economic life for businesses that were short, nasty, and brutish. On the other hand, if you look at the period of globalization from roughly 1990 through today, and you look at the profit share of national income in the developed economies, it went up from about 8.5% to about 13%. So in that sense of this relentless global competition, it never seems to have existed at all. On the other hand, there are clearly sectors that are seriously affected. Manufacturing being one obvious one. But again, you have to be, I think, really careful about where the forces are that are at work. So on the one hand, you do have globalization. You do have the pressure of imports from places like China, the developing world, that have caused a lot of concern. But on the other hand, if you look at where the manufacturing jobs have gone, they've almost entirely disappeared through productivity growth. So if you go back to the old days when Ross Perot used to talk about the giant sucking sound of jobs going to Mexico, if you actually looked at where those jobs went, 15% of them did go to imports or did disappear to imports. But 85% of those jobs disappeared to productivity growth. So when you look at sort of the advance of manufacturing productivity relative to manufacturing demand, and therefore what is this overwhelming force in the growth of the service sector, which is also, by the way, I think responsible for the profitability. I think that there's an 800-pound sort of long-term technological set of trends that really has gotten a lot of the credit to given a lot of the credit to globalization really wasn't necessarily there. And if you look at what's happened today, if you, for example, look at China's trade growth for China is about 2.5% a year and has been since 2011. So I think you've got to be really careful to put these forces in perspective and to look at globalization not as this large, overwhelming force, but in great detail, that there are sectors, there are parts of the population that are greatly affected. But I think if you just take a broad view, you're going to very seriously overstate what's going on, and I think miss a lot of the areas of real concern.
So I want to come back to China, Bruce, but because of your investing fame, I want to ask you, are there any investing themes in where you see globalization playing out in this more dominant role of technological change that you mentioned?
Oh, I think there are two crucial things here. And here I think everybody ought to be aware that the way you make money in investing is by having monopoly power. The way you have monopoly power is that you dominate markets. Big global markets are very difficult to dominate. So if you look at the period literally from 1950 through 1990, where markets really are going global, profits are consistently disappointing for the big global corporations. But if you look at what's happened since then, and as I say, the profits have been much better than expected. I mean, profit share has increased by about 50%. It's because what's happened is that you've got local service markets where goods are locally produced and consumed, and those local service markets are small markets that can be dominated. So a typical example of that is John Deere. John Deere makes equipment. When it was trading that equipment in big global markets, it suffered from the profit pressure of everybody else. But now what it offers is in every locality, it has software that drives smart agricultural machines that are run off GPS satellites. It's entirely local. It has service support. It has financing that's based on local information, and it has local secondhand markets. So if you're now a locality, which is 90% Deere equipment, they have the economies of scale and infrastructure that means that AGCO and Kubota really have no chance of getting into those markets. So I think the way money is going to be made is to understand where you can build local infrastructure that benefits from local economies of scale. And if anybody's looked at the Deere stock price over the last 5 years, you can see the extraordinary power, rather, of that kind of selective local focus.
Okay, great. Thanks for that tip here on Chazen Street Week, I guess. So Joe, let me turn back to you with the China discussion. So sometimes the United States, irrespective of whether it's a Republican or a Democratic president, has the view that China should just look a little bit more like us. Well, that sounds more like a wish list than a strategy. What should U.S. strategy be with respect to China and globalization, realizing China is another major power?
Well, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was Francis Fukuyama wrote this book, The End of History, and he articulated a view that was widely shared at the time that trade would accelerate the convergence. That's why it was called the end of history. Everybody was going to be liberal democracies and free market economies. In retrospect, that was a little bit of a fantasy, although for a while there was a movement in that direction. I think there's a broad consensus that President Xi may represent a deviation, under Wang Zhibao or under his predecessor. There was some movement in that direction, some reason to be optimistic. But at this point, I think there's not much reason to be optimistic. So what that means is I think we should not view trade policy as something likely to accomplish our objective. On the other hand, I think the zero-sum view of the world that was articulated in the previous administration is also wrong. That there are lots of things that we benefit from by addressing together, global problems that could only be addressed together. So I think we have to get over the zero-sum perspective, but we also have to get over the perspective that if we only open up trade, China is going to follow our lead and become a liberal democracy and a market economy. I think we have to get over both of those fallacies. And in that in-between space is where the challenge is going to be. And I think it's not going to be easy as the discussions going on right now in Anchorage are suggesting. There's going to be a lot of posturing. And then the question is, can we go beyond the posturing to find those areas of commonality and recognize that there's going to be conflict?
Yeah, I want to come back to the point you made, Joe, about global public goods and bads. But first, Bruce, ping back to you. U.S.-China strategy and globalization, are we on the right path? Do we need to reset?
Well, I mean, I think that you have to be really careful. And I think this is one of the things that we emphasize in the course, to understand that local cultures are different. And I'm not a political expert on this, but just in economic terms, there are cultures in which public institutions work really well. And there are other cultures in which public institutions don't work so well. And I think you have to understand that to stand outside a culture and prescribe an economic system for it is not something that's historically worked particularly well. I think you have to have a fairly deep local understanding of local culture. And I'll give you one example of that, which I hope makes people humble about these kinds of interventions and kind of belief in uniform sort of global business practices. If you look at Australia and New Zealand, they both privatized they privatized their telephone utilities. In New Zealand, there was very little effect on the operation. The operation was efficient before the privatization, and it was efficient after the privatization. In Australia, there was an enormous difference, that the public telephone company got much more efficient. Now, who knew that Australia and New Zealand were such different cultures when it came to business organization? So I would just be extremely careful about trying to prescribe global rules for business operations in the face of these really fundamental cultural differences.
Joe, I want to come back to you on
Can I mention
global.
one?
Yeah, of course. Jump in.
As we try to get global rules, we have to realize that the values differ very greatly. So, for instance, Europeans are putting a lot more emphasis on privacy, and earlier they had put a lot more emphasis on their view of GMOs, whether we agree with their view of GMOs. The fact is they feel intensely about it. And when you have to develop global rules, when societies have such different views, it's going to be difficult. And we will have to recognize, we can't just simply assume that our values are the ones that ought to predominate. We are going to have to recognize that citizens are in Europe, where they have a democracy, are going to feel very strongly, and we will have to accommodate that. And then the different across the.
Yeah, let me pull out that thread, Joe, if I might, about values versus the underlying problems we're trying to solve. So while values may differ, There's some common problems, going back to the global public goods and bads. Climate change comes to mind. The pandemic itself comes to mind. Do we have the right international institutions to bring major blocs together, China, the European Union, United States, Japan, others, to solve those problems?
Well, I think we have some institutions that actually seem to work pretty well. Not, all institutions are imperfect. Human fallibility is part of life, and institutions created by humans are going to be fallible as well. But for instance, I think that the leadership of the IMF, institution that I've been very critical at times, in trying to respond to the pandemic was very impressive. They really did change very strongly their focus at the moment on austerity. The EU, which I think behaved very badly in response to the euro crisis, the pandemic changed dramatically and showed a kind of flexibility that I thought was impressive. So, these institutions don't always do exactly what I would recommend, but that's the nature of democratic politics, that different people have different views. But as I looked at the way they responded to the pandemic, I was actually quite impressed.
What do you think, Bruce?
Well, I take a different view of this. I think if you look at successes, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the ozone layer, there's a big value to decentralized operation there. The history of the Montreal Convention is actually that the ozone hole is identified. The US acts that technology is developed in the United States that replaces the chlorofluorocarbons. And it's only after that that you get the Montreal Convention where everybody can suddenly agree. So that it really was an individual action within one country that worked well. I'll give you another example where I think that there may be certain kinds of societies that respond better than others. I think that if we cannot control global population, we are not going to control global climate. When you look from that perspective, it's actually fairly optimistic. Outside of Africa, fertility rates are essentially between slightly below and significantly below replacement costs. So by the time the end of this century occurs, you should have everywhere else but Africa in the world with declining population. On the other hand, you may have between 4 and 6 million Africans by that time, and there are huge development challenges in that context. Well, I don't know that international institutions are going to be able to develop a consensus on how to deal with that. But China has dealt with population growth in a controversial way, admittedly, but you could imagine that a direct relationship between the Chinese and the African governments built around the Belt and Road Initiative might contribute substantially to the problem of population control in Africa. And I think that waiting for international consensus may actually slow down the effective implementation of programs for encouraging global public goods like population control. So I have a little more laissez-faire attitude towards this, I think, than Joe does.
Well, laissez-faire generally works with me. I'll certainly take that one. But let me go back to an issue that's really at the core of the Chazen Institute's mission about trade. And here I want to take a particular international institution, the World Trade Organization. So strictly speaking, the way the World Trade Organization defines its criteria for membership and operation, China really doesn't meet those criteria. And this has been part of battles among China, European Union, Japan, the United States for some time. Do we need to reform the WTO in any way? Again, going back to my earlier question, we can't just ask China to be exactly like us. So how do we make the WTO workable and flexible in an environment where there are going to be different economic systems? Joe.
Well, first, I think we have to recognize that the economic model that predominated when the WTO was established. Remember, it was the Uruguay round negotiations that were done under President Bush, and then got the first President Bush, and then got ratified under President Clinton. A set of views of the economy predominated, and that was in this particular period where everybody thought we were going to converge to free market economies. So there was a set of ideas that dominated. I think now we have to recognize that those ideas are not going to be accepted, that China is not going to become a market economy. But we still have gains to trade across different countries, and we need global cooperation, and we have to have rules that work under a more, you might say, heterodox perspective. So that's, it seems to me, the fundamental change that has to occur. Now, organizationally, the what's happened in the last 4 years has shown the fragility of the WTO. If the United States says it's not going to participate, the whole thing comes to a halt. And I think the other countries of the world are coming to the view that that cannot be a way of going forward. There has to be a structure where if one country leaves, even if it's a powerful one, the rest of the world needs to go on with some kind of rules-based system. So I think there's going to have to be some changes in the basically unanimity rules that prevail. There are legal experts who say that they didn't really need that unanimity, but Europe was afraid to violate, to go beyond that at that moment. So to me, I think it has to go. It still has to be consensus, but not unanimity.
Bruce, what do you think? Unanimity
Well,
rules, other rules?
I think that we're in a period where the rules have been under enormous stress. I mean, I think that everybody's trying to save manufacturing jobs. Given the technological long-term trends that I talked about, nobody's going to succeed. I mean, you hear politicians promise these jobs, and they're just not going to be there, and it's going to be technology more than trade that eliminates it. But I think once they're gone, and they will be gone in 10 to 15 years, maybe 25 years, I think the stress of trying to save those jobs is going to disappear. On the other hand, I think there is a huge problem that the WTO, as it's currently constituted, is not prepared to address. And I think that that really is a larger issue than one of how we can sort of adjust the WTO rules. And it is this: there has been one successful model of development, and it is export-led growth, and that's necessarily been manufacturing-led growth. Well, as manufacturing dies, that model is going away, and you still need development. And I think what you're going to have to start to think about, and whether it's the WTO or some other set of institutions, is how you are going to encourage development in, and I think here again, Africa is the locus of the most concern here, but also certain parts of Latin America. And I think in the absence of a vibrant, growing manufacturing sector, and you can see the rate of growth, very slow rate of growth of manufacturing trade, that's going to be an enormous problem. So I think that it's really that the existing institutional structure is not well adapted to the problems that we're dealing with. And I just am not optimistic that there are alternative structures, unless Joe develops them, that are going to step up to deal with these problems. And I'd like to hear from Joe how he hopes that'll work out.
So quickly, Joe,
So
develop one for
let
us.
me well let me first let me say the deficiencies in the current arrangements have been made clear by some of the discussions of the WTO right now on the intellectual property regime. There's a lot of concern about, in the midst of this pandemic, we want to get vaccines available, therapeutics, protective gear available everywhere. It is really a global public good that the pandemic be brought under control everywhere, especially with the mutations going on. And yet, a few countries are refusing to have an emergency adaptation of the intellectual property rules at the WTO for the pandemic. And that just heightens the fact that they're unable to respond quickly. But it's not the WTO the problem is, it's really the individual countries that make up the WTO. And so that's where I share some of the pessimism that Bruce has. You know, getting global agreements is really hard, and it takes a lot of time. And we've been aware of climate change now for 30 years, and there has been movement, but it's been very slow. But let me be on the positive, optimistic side. There has been movement.
Let me go to an even bigger problem, if I might. I know our audience is going to think we're all from the dismal science, and I guess we are, but I want to go to a problem that both of you have mentioned and has come up in a couple of audience questions. When I opened the conference this morning, I referred to the fact that old style globalization took the rules of the game as given and just told the economy to adjust. That kind of approach didn't really endear itself in broad social support for globalization. And so a couple of questions have come in. If you take technological change, which I agree is the larger disruptive force, and globalization together, while they've raised productivity, while they've raised living standards, they've also caused some disruption, and not everyone, of course, is better off. How would you suggest that policymakers could retain more benefits while managing costs? Do you have specific kinds of policies for people who've been left behind, whether it's technological change or globalization? Bruce.
Okay, I mean, I think that, again, it's something you've got to think about in detail. I mean, the transition to services, forget globalization, is a brutal process. Service jobs are decentralized jobs, which means it's harder to generate productivity in decentralized service institutions than it is in big centralized manufacturing institutions. People tend to work individually, so you get a much broader distribution of income than you do in manufacturing jobs. And frankly, the lower tail of service jobs are just not as well paid as manufacturing jobs. So you've got this enormous transition in the economy to a situation where, independent of globalization, you've got very serious challenges in coping with living standards or adjustments to living standards. I think that that's got to be dealt with on a country by country, institution by institution basis. I think that when you look at disruptive technology, there are industries that have been substantially disrupted, but there are other industries that have not been so substantially disrupted. So again, I think you've got to think about an inventory of where do you intervene in detail. I think just looking at it from a broad perspective is probably not going to do you much good and is going to be contentious and not particularly effective. So that's really, I think, the lesson that individual countries, individual regions, individual industries have got to think about where they're going.
Well, let me take this country.
Let me pick up on
Joe. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me just pick up on what Bruce said and probably answer the question you were about to ask. There's a portfolio of things different countries can do, And picking up with what Bruce said, what's appropriate for one country may not be appropriate for other. So, for instance, Sweden has done a fairly good job of using two instruments. One is called active labor market policies, and the other is industrial policies. And those are policies that help actively move people from one job to another and create new jobs in new sectors. So they've been quite successful in helping restructure the economy. And they did it very explicitly because they, as a small economy, were aware that they had to be open. They had to be open to globalization. If they closed themselves off, their standard of living would go down so dramatically. So for them, there was no choice as they viewed it. The United States, one of the things that research has exposed is going back to the simple model that we had 30 years ago, was that labor moved very easily across the country. What we saw in the last, as we looked at the data, that's not true, that there are particular locations that have been very badly affected by globalization. So it's not only particular industries, but also particular parts of the country, and that's had political consequences. And so that means that there needs to be more attention, perhaps, on place-based policies. But in addition to that, I think the United States has to think about redistributive policies that help people share some of the prosperity that we get out of globalization. And I know that we've had previous conversations where both you and Bruce have put a lot of emphasis on the earned income tax credit as a mechanism of both incentivizing people to participate in the labor force. We need lots of jobs. I mean, we need lots of work to be done, climate change, caring for the elderly. There's lots of work that has to be done. And so it makes sense to try to get people into the labor force. But on the other hand, the market hasn't provided livable wages. And this is a policy that brings those two together. I support those. I'm a little bit more concerned about monopsony power in the labor market. And so I also support an increase in the minimum wage.
Okay, quick translation since I write economics textbooks. So monopsony power would be firms using their power to compress wages below market outcome. And Joe had referred to place-based aid, which would be things like federal support for state and local areas. Joe, you mentioned the earned income tax credit. Is there anything more we could be doing to do one of two things, either prepare people for different jobs or reform our social insurance programs that were actually designed for a world we don't particularly live in right now?
Well, as the active labor market policies are what you call the policies that help people move from the jobs that were in the past to the jobs that are new, and that includes training, education, on-the-job training. In many cases, Bruce is a big supporter of on-the-job training, and he can explain why. But also helping people move in location, because a lot of the jobs are being created in different places where their jobs are being destroyed. So there's an important role for this kind of active labor market policies. One of the things that our social insurance system was designed for was a world where people lived just a couple of years after retirement. And now people are living much longer. Not all. Some people do die, particularly a lot of the people in the blue collar jobs work very hard lives and their life expectancies are short. So the disparity in life expectancies in the United States are very large. And one of the things is that the healthier people we'd like to be, they want to be in the labor force. And I think for our society, it's a good thing to bring them into the labor force. But on the other hand, we have lots of people who are not so healthy. And that's a real challenge in reforming of our social insurance system, Social Security particularly.
Yeah, can I just say something about that? Because I think that the earned income tax credit has potential that we've really only just begun to tap. So when people think about sort of earned income, they think about 40 hours a week. And I think that's a mistake. I think that if we could get people to work 1,000 hours a year at, say, $9 an hour, we could, within the scope of the cost of current sort of income support programs, we could give those people who are making $9,000 a year an extra $27,000. And then, of course, it would go away as their incomes increase. And it seems to me that you do want the cohesive effect of people participating in the labor force. And I think even the relatively unhealthy people and the older people, because you want them, and I think there's a lot of evidence that continuing to participate in jobs in the labor force does extend longevity. But, you know, working 20 hours a week, not 40 hours a week, I think is a potential that you want to think about tapping. So I think that there's a lot of adjustment that could be done within the scope of existing structures.
I agree with that. I think you two have identified many good things, both for preparing people for new kinds of jobs and for reconnecting them when things go awry. I want to take us to a different place that I thought about based on what you've both said here. Something at the intersection of technological change and globalization, which is the very big tech firms. Those firms have dominated a lot of industry and have made globalization headlines. And I want to think about a few areas for globalization and global rules in that context. And let me start with competition policy. So, Joe, you mentioned earlier about how the US and Europeans view things differently. Do we need to rethink competition policy, technology, either the United States or Europe? Do we need a global system? What do you think?
Oh, I think we clearly do, and I think there are 2 points here, very broad points. The first is that in the middle of the last century, there was a view that became dominant, that markets are naturally competitive, and there was an undermining through the court of competition law, antitrust law. So the presumption that markets are naturally competitive goes against the things that Bruce talked about earlier, the changes in technology, network externalities, low marginal cost, all the changes in our society and our economy were actually moving us from a world where there was a competitive potential to one where competition was naturally much lower. And the reinterpretation of competition law would have had a problem had there not been the changes in technology. But we would have needed a new competition law just because the world of Standard Oil and the cases that mark the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century are just so different from the technologies of the 21st century. So we clearly need new competition law. Much more difficult. We're going to have to reinterpret,
Bruce, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think that the fundamental development that's created the tech companies is the ability of technology to put systems together. So if you look at IBM, IBM did everything. You look at General Motors did everything. General Electric, the same sort of thing with electrical systems. Now you've got a world where Microsoft does only operating systems and related software. Oracle does only database systems and related software. Intel does only CPU chips. Adobe does fonts and graphics. You've got specialized companies that occupy niches and enjoy huge economies of scale. Google does really only search. And once you've got natural monopolies like that, traditional remedies have consistently failed. And so I think what you've got to start thinking about is you're not going to break these companies up. You're going to have a single operating system. You're going to have a single database structure system. You're going to have a single search technology that people are good at and so on. And you're going to have to live with that. And I think the challenge is going to be how can you compensate for the downside of those monopolies? And here, I actually think they may not work so badly economically, especially if you can find some way of taxing the excess profits. But where I think they do work badly is in the information industries, where you have information monopolies with very powerful ideologies. And that is a huge problem. And to be honest, I have no idea what you can do about it. Joe,
No,
this is
that's
you again.
Well, that's where I wanted to go next, because another big area for the global tech firms, in addition to competition policy, is social media and privacy concerns. Now, Europe has pushed with GDPR. The US is still trying to find its way. Joe, how do you think about this from a policy perspective?
Well, let me go back for a second. One of the issues, Bruce is right. It's going to be very difficult to break up these things in the way that we broke up Standard Oil or the telephone company. But we are going to have to regulate behavior. That is to say, they have engaged in anti-competitive practices that amplify and extend their market power in areas where it's not necessary. And that results actually in a squelching of innovation. So in some ways, there's a battle going on right now, for instance, among the giants, where Apple, trying to be a defender of individual rights, is saying that it's going to make it easier for users of Apple to set higher privacy standards. Now, the Facebook are really upset about that because they don't want people to be able to set their own privacy standards because what they're doing is taking your data, and that's the key input into their business model. So I think in those areas, and which is related to what Bruce was talking about in information, I think there needs to be government regulation that in that particular case is on the side of Apple. But then one has to make sure that Apple is regulated about using its market power, like in the Apple store, to in a somewhat abusive way to get these 30% profits off of everybody who wants to have an app on Apple. So he's going to be regulating the abuse of market power that is going to be the focus, I think, going forward.
Bruce, any thoughts on social media, privacy?
Well, I mean, I love Google. And the problem with Google is it's getting harder and harder to use because there are certain things they don't want you to find out. And there are certain things that they do want you to find out. And I think somehow you've got a set of rules that equalizes the access to information. And I think that applies to social media too. And I think crafting those rules is, sad to say, going to be incredibly difficult and politically very fraught. And I'm not optimistic that we are going to come up with a useful solution. I think it's about more than privacy. I think it's literally about, and I hate to give a shout out to George Orwell, but I think it's about information control. And I think that that's where the regulation has got to go.
Okay, we've had Adam Smith, we've had
Yeah,
Hobbes,
it's
we've had
information
George
and it's
Orwell. Go ahead, Joe.
no, it's about information and it's about disinformation, and it actually touches on almost every aspect of our society: incitement, hate, and some of the most difficult issues in social organization today. One of the aspects that I should, as just an economist, one of the reasons that we say markets work well is what is called technically the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics, where everybody faces the same prices. So you have the marginal valuation of a good the same for everybody. But one of the things that's happening in the new technology, information technologies, is that they're having individual specific prices, price discrimination, and that undermines the efficiency of the market and transfers consumer surplus to the tech giants. So it actually really goes to the heart of what makes a market economy works.
So one thing I will say about social media and privacy, feel free to keep the tweets coming about the conference. I see those are nice. Gentlemen, before I do a couple of lightning round questions that from our audience, I want to go to the class you're teaching and have taught for a long time at Columbia Business School. When you teach globalization, what are your goals for the students as future business leaders? What are you up to, Bruce?
Okay, well, I'll say I think there are two lessons we really try, or I really try and enforce in the business part of the course. The first is that in a global world, you need a really well-crafted local geographic strategy. And that applies to product space, where you're thinking of niche products, as well as to physical geography. The second thing is you better know what your people are doing, whether it's local or global. So the classic case that I hope my students never get trapped in is there is a company in Germany that is historically been reasonably well run. They're the leading car wash machine manufacturer in the world. And the head of that company thinks it's all about manufacturing. But when you look at what his people do, he has 1,800 employees. 200 of them deal with overhead. 350 of them manufacture and design stuff. And 1,250 of them service the systems on a decentralized local basis. And if you think you are a centralized global manufacturing company as opposed to a collection of local service operations in that world, you are heading for trouble. And so I think it's understanding the local structure of activity in this increasingly global world.
Okay, local meets global. Joe, what do you think? What's the big thing students should take from the class?
Well, part of it is that business operates in a political environment with rules set by governments and internationally. And the international dimension of globalization, the policy dimension of globalization, along the lines that we've discussed for the last hour, are among the issues. The complexity of trade rules, rules on global finance, rules on intellectual property, the international public goods of environment and health. These are all things that we try to bring out in the course. And that international dimension is shaping the business environment in one way or another everywhere.
I should say that for everybody who's watching this, we'll be sending you information about what these two great economists are doing in that class. I think we'll have time for maybe one quick lightning round. You've talked about waves of growth and globalization. Looking forward, Who are the next tigers? What economies in the world should we be looking for as the vanguard, the new success stories in globalization, Joe?
Well, I've always been a great admirer of small countries that are able to go into addressing certain issues. And we've seen how a few small countries have done very well in the pandemic. Of course, they tend to be islands, and so they can be more isolated, but they get more social cohesion. And so the response of New Zealand, Taiwan, to the pandemic has been very impressive and has energized these two places. And it'll be interesting to see whether they can capitalize on that going forward and use that to get niches. They won't be the dominant firms in the world, but they will find niches that will be able to raise the living standards of their citizens.
Bruce, what do you think?
Okay, the coming industries are going to be service industries, medical care, education, and the heart of those industries is going to be human resources. And I think the economies that are best at attracting global human resources are the ones that are going to do really well. And at the moment, if you look around, the country that is most receptive to recruiting smart foreigners and most successful at it is the United States. So I'm actually reasonably optimistic that in many crucial industries where we are already leaders, like high-end education, it is the United States that's going to be the tiger, especially if we can successfully decentralize and get the benefits of small, cohesive political units in the way Joe talked about Sweden and the island economies.
So we got small countries, we've got services, we've got tips all around. Thanks so much to Bruce Greenwald, to Joe Stiglitz for a very stimulating conversation. At the Chazen Institute, we participate in this, trying to encourage faculty research in these areas all the time. And Bruce and Joe have really brought it to life in class. So thank you very, very much.
For the consumers in us, globalization means that we have access to the largest collection of goods at the best price. For the producers in us, globalization means that we must compete with the most efficient producers no matter how far away. People may like one, but not the other.
I'm an operations guy. I look at globalization as supply chain. That movement of capital, information, material, people is the essence of globalization for me. And globalization was suffering, had pre-existing condition even before pandemic. Thanks to Trump, thanks to Brexit. But the COVID gave a mortal blow. And in that sense, it will take a long time to recover.
Globalization is something that requires a lot of work. It requires designing policies that ensure that not just a handful of people benefit from globalization, but all of society. And only then will we see the public support for globalization increase.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Laurent Ganem. I'm the founder and chief executive of G Square, which is a private equity firm dedicated to investing in healthcare, essentially in Europe, with about 1 billion euros under management for the moment. We are based in London. Our team has about 20 people featuring 14 different nationalities. You know, London offers a lot of diversity. And since I started this firm about a dozen years ago, we've done 20 investments in more than 20 countries, actually, of course, in Europe, but also in Israel and Latin America. We're not totally global, but we're aspiring to be. And I've been on the board of the Chazen Institute for the past 7 years, and it's my great pleasure and honor to moderate this extremely prestigious panel. And I will start by briefly introducing our panelists. I could spend the rest of the 30 minutes introducing them as their CV is so prestigious, but I'll start with Lulu Wang, who is among other things, co-chair of the Chazen Institute and has been a board member for, I think, 14 years. You're Chinese, but were born in India. You're truly a global investor in public and private equities, debt, many things. So today you are the founder and CEO of Tupelo Capital Management in New York. I cannot say the rest of your career because it would take too long, but you're on the board of a number of companies, a number of institutions, of charities. You're giving back a lot to the society. And I'm sorry that I had to summarize, but this is in a nutshell who you are. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Laurent.
Mary, sincerely, you know, I've known you for a little while now, and you know, your CV and experience are among the most impressive and the most global I've ever had given the opportunity to look at. And sincerely, you were born in Jamaica, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
You came to New York very early on to study, but then, you know, you've lived all over the place, and you're talking about all the books in different languages, but you lived in China, Korea, Japan, I may forget something, Latin America, Europe. You speak those languages, which is so impressive. And obviously in the US, and after, you know, an incredible international career, bringing you from China to Japan to Latin America to Europe, etc., back to the US, and in particular at General Electric, you are now for about a year the chief executive of Trimark USA, which is the largest producer of food service equipment in the United States,
Yeah.
Which is not yet global, but that's very interesting. We'll talk about it later. And Filippo De Vecchi, you're an Italian by birth, but you live in Hong Kong now. And you spent years, of course, in the US, Latin America, various countries, and mainland China in Shanghai a number of years ago. You have a very impressive career as a private equity investor at Advent International, and we're very pleased to have you with us this morning. And thank you very much. All of the four of us have in common that we have an MBA from Columbia Business School at different ages, I would say. So it's a long time ago, like Lulu and myself, and Filippo and Mary more recently. Okay, let me start with this. So throughout your experience, would you give examples of why globalization has been so essential in conducting your business and how it has changed over time? May I start with you, Lulu?
Oh, thank you very much, Laurent. To begin with, my basic style of investing is bottom-up growth and looking for the very best growth companies. And of course, if you can go globally, you can certainly find even more of the very best companies. And so very early on in my career, I began to look globally rather than just looking in the US where I reside. And I'd been investing for a long time. I'd been through some wonderful opening up periods. I guess the most exciting time was after '76 when China reopened and its markets were open to the Western world, and every consumer company in the world was trying to get into China. So that was a heady time, and I was just beginning to be an analyst then. But then when the '80s came and technology and wireless began to be a very big technology, the leadership was really in Asia and Europe. And if you wanted to be in this very important growth sector, you really had to go overseas. So I directed my attention and my staff to looking for the best of breed growth companies in the overseas markets. And those are the days when Docomo and Vodafone and Nokia were really leading the pack in cellular. So it was important for us to make our company global very quickly. And we also found out that by following companies globally, they're often in the expansionary mode, especially if they're US based. And that gave us a chance to look at the expansion process, because that's always fraught with risk. And for an investor, looking for losers and winners is very important on the long, short side. So wherever there's great change, seismic change, there are opportunities for investors.
Thank you very much, Lulu. Mary, can you tell us about your experience of globalization with your going all over the place?
Absolutely, Laurent. Good morning again, and thank you. It is a privilege to be on this panel with such distinguished guests. So good day, everyone. And honestly, I hope everyone is healthy and safe. Again, Laurent, you mentioned that we're all alum of the business school, and I graduated in 2001, and you mentioned currently Chief Executive Officer of Trimark USA. And we've actually been in the food service industry for over 73 continuous years, and we have over 2.1 billion in revenue and over 3,200 employees, pretty much owned by Blackstone and Centerbridge. And I also actually serve on the Masco Board of Directors on both the audit and compensation committees for the last 4 years. But going to your question, Laurent, in terms of globalization, how it's essential in conducting business, in my experience, in my nearly 25 years of business. So obviously globalization, we know it's really the process by which businesses or organizations, right, they develop international influence or start operating on an international scale. And when I had joined GE Capital back in 1995, really, the CEO back then, Jack Welch, had gone on a globalization journey. And as we know, given COVID-19, we're seeing the world continue to face unprecedented challenges. But coronavirus-induced challenges notwithstanding, I believe you either let the world change around you or you lean in and try to help change the world. And so for me, with my background at GE, it's been truly global. As you mentioned, I've lived and worked in several countries. But you think about first, big companies, they recognize the opportunities by creating those forces of globalization. And that was embraced, as I mentioned, by Jack Welch. And it was really about how businesses in critical ways can impact the range of policies that include human capital management, whether it's through outsourcing manufacturing plants in developing countries, shifting R&D, and really understanding how to protect intellectual property, and then really concentrating on the local workforces in the operations while you're dealing with cross-cultural differences. So how do we make sure that there's an increased focus on exports, and now how do we have a truly global supply chain? So I really think globalization really created substantial challenges for companies, pretty much because of emerging economies like China or India really wanting to play a greater role in the global marketplace, but also given the managing of currencies, as well as the shift that you see happening now around protectionism, given some of the trade deals that have been made. So I think globalization, it's been demonstrated to really, Laurent, we've talked about this, able to lift people out of poverty, but has also led to some inequality from a wage and income gap perspective. And I think we can take care of that. But my experience has been truly amazing in terms of learning how to live and work in very different cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is quite unique, I would say. And Filippo, you've also lived in different cultures.
Yes, no, absolutely. So my more recent experience over the past 21 years has been with the private equity firm Advent International. And already international is very much part of the brand name, which tells, something about, globalization and the importance of being global of the firm. Over the past 21 years with Advent, I've been I worked in 3 continents and 4 offices, 2 of which I started. in Shanghai and in Hong Kong. And very much at the core of the job that I was tasked to do, particularly over the past decade, has been to transfer the Advent model of doing buyouts and sector knowledge to a new geography, more specifically China. And the way that we have done that is really to leverage on the Advent sector expertise that was globally developed in the US and in Europe, and really transfer the knowledge into China. Of course, a very competitive private equity market, but with a few buyouts at that time, and really start to develop a pipeline of possible transactions, and ultimately getting traction, leveraging really on the global expertise of the firm. So really, globalization has been instrumental and essential in bringing the Advent model into China. And the way to do it has been really to leverage on these relationship with global partners, and then also to hire a local team which was aligned in terms of approach to the Advent way of doing transactions.
I was going to ask you, Filippo, what was the proportion of local team versus non-local team, and who was leading?
So the only expert was actually myself, and so all the people that I hired, on the China team have been, local Chinese, but of course with international education and international experience, so that they could liaise well with an international firm like us. And so we very much believe in developing the local talent. And ultimately, this is also a trend that we're seeing in terms of globalization, that the local offices tend to be more localized, and obviously COVID has accelerated this trend.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you very much. Let's talk about leadership management towards globalization, if you will. How do you bring globalization into your companies or your investments, and how it may change in the future? Maybe we start with Mary, because again, I'm very much intrigued with your company, which is US, and you want to take it more global.
Absolutely, Laurent. Would love to take it globally. And obviously, for all the uncertainties and anxieties you see in the headline today, I think the world is a much better place than it's ever been, right? So you think about the emerging markets, so billions of people have moved out of extreme poverty, as I've mentioned. But also, I think, Laurent, in the developed world, we enjoy better medicines, connectivity, and mobility than any of us could have imagined even 20 years ago. I remember when I first went to China in 1999, and I was an anomaly in China then. And then I moved there in 2003. And you think about Shanghai of 1999 is very different than the Shanghai of 2020.
Mary, I saw Shanghai in 1981, so that wasn't so different.
Very different, right? So you see the photos and the astounding in how showing the significant investment China has made in their economy, their infrastructure, technology, and innovation. So I do think the promise of global progress has become a reality for many, but not all. So I think while globalization has really focused on creating, I think, low-cost global supply chains, I think you'll see a future shift from that perspective. As I think about our company, we get a lot of products from international, where we do private label because of the labor cost differentials, and it frame and it shapes how it impacts our companies, right? So it's not just emphasizing only on cost base, but we have to look at the benefits of the trade and the technology. We have to look at the benefits of advanced manufacturing or even scaling production. We know that there's an increase in flexibility in enabling production to move closer to the consumer so that you're limiting the impact on the supply chain, as we saw what happened in COVID, and how right now you look at the ports, a lot of the ships are there, and they're over a month away from being pulled into port. And so we're seeing that change, right? So we're seeing that basic broadening of goods and realigning rewards closer to people. So I'd love to actually bring our company global. I think Europe would be a fantastic place to start. We're already in the US and Canada. I also think Mexico is also a phenomenal place, as is Latin America, because I've lived there. And it's a great cultural aspect around the food service industry. And so I think we have an opportunity to really grow our company from that perspective. And Laurent, one more thing, if you think about just how much the US does in trade with the other nations, right? Over 4.9 trillion per year. And the largest trade partners are China, Canada, and Mexico. And then Japan fourth. So for us, that looks like great opportunities for us to expand our business into those different countries.
I've no doubt you will. No doubt you will. That's very exciting. We are going to witness this over the next few years, I'm sure. Filippo, so how do you drive strategy? Because in private equity, we're very much into strategy. Drive strategy to intensify globalization in your business, especially at the time of pandemic. I mean, I think it's Mary already touched upon it, but
yes, no, absolutely. So the way that we drive globalization in our firm is really starting with the sector team. So we have global professionals dedicated to the sector teams, and we follow 5 sectors globally: business and financial services, industrial, consumer, healthcare, and technology. And we have really global teams allocated and associated to these sectors that collaborate on a weekly basis to identify the most attractive opportunities. And then also within the investment committee, we have talent from really all over the world, so that when we look at a local opportunity, for example, in China, in a specific sector, we put that in the global context of that sector, because we have already seen in some of these sectors these trends elsewhere. And lastly, when we end up doing an investment, the way that we structure the board often really leverages on the global sector expertise. And so very often on these global companies, we have global colleagues from either the US or Europe that sit on these boards. So we really try to bring our global expertise to the benefit of the local transactions.
Yeah, I'm very glad that you believe in sector focus. As you know, I'm the one. And thank you very much, Filippo. And Lulu, examples of leadership management and maybe comments on the importance of digital. I know that digital and global, I think that you're very much versed into this.
Right. Well, it's I think globalization has developed a whole new form of research and analysis by investors, because when you think globally, the whole world is your laboratory, and your choice is immense of the number of options there to invest. And I think I've always trained my analysts to really look, don't work in silos, don't even think within industries or within geographies, but look for the very best practices worldwide. And very often, if they are truly the best practices, you'll see them beginning to be adopted by others. And the trend, and if you can be in front of these trends, see who are the likely winners and losers, again, it gives you great opportunities as an investor. And I think Marie talks often about supply chain, and that's really been a great opportunity for a global investor. Clearly, as you are investing, you're operating globally or investing globally, you're going to have to set up new supply chains, and that's where the opportunity comes on the positive side to have very good leverage, on the negative side to do it badly, to not partner with the right suppliers or raw material vendors or distributors, and then the supply chain becomes a nightmare. So that in itself has been a great fodder for investors overseas. I mean, a good example would be when the fast food companies had arrived in Asia. I give that as an example. They really had to deliver a standardized product, but there was no standardized suppliers. So they had to go and create their own cottage industry of suppliers to develop their own rolls, their own chicken, their own hamburger. And it was a very exciting time, but also fraught with risk because you didn't have the quality controls. And here you were pledged to have a very standard product. So many opportunities for success or failure. And I think when you had the movement toward global sourcing for the soft goods products, this is again going back to the 80s, the time when Li and Fung was really the major supplier to companies like Kohl's and Walmart's. Again, you saw the opportunity for those who did it well to really benefit in having a competitive cost. And those who did not do it well, they were mired in inventory. So, and then digitization was very important because to monitor all of these moving parts as a global investor, having connections to the on-the-ground people in the countries you're investing was very important. And I always worked with my team to make sure that they were very much in touch with day-to-day things because for most global investors who don't do that, they're often the last ones to know when it's a problem until it's in the headlines and then the stock's crashing. But to really stay in touch, find out what's going on. And the most important part was to find the best management team. I think my investing has always been look for the best managers, and then if the business model works out and the industry is okay, but look for the best of breed among the managements. And that allowed me to really find some wonderful long-term holdings I've had for some over 10 years. And the great companies that emerged out of China, the Alibabas and the Tencents, Meituan, it all began because I was there, feet on the ground, to meet with managers and love the management team. And then subsequently, being able to communicate digitally was a very important way to stay in touch. Also, even a quieter company, not a tech company, but China Merchants, a very interesting pioneer in fintech, adapted very early, and many of our Western banks learned from what they were doing. That again was having a chance to meet the great Ma Weihua, who was the one who pioneered it. Actually, I helped to bring him to Columbia to be a speaker. And then subsequently, he introduced me to his successor, Hui Yuchuan, who is the new breed of technocrat, very tech savvy and very successful in following the business model created by Ma Weihua. So management really is everything. And like Filippo, I think the best companies, particularly Westerners going into China, have done very well hiring locally to not force feed their US teams or their US product marketing practices, but really look for the best talent on the ground in their domestic markets. So always think globally, but hire and act locally.
Yeah, that's a great tip. Absolutely. Thank you very much, Lulu. Very, very interesting. Very interesting. Now let's talk about the flip side of this. I mean, from your vantage point as a corporate leader, Marie, or investors, Lulu and Filippo, what do you see as the main risks and dangers of globalization, especially at the time when ESG, which was unknown, especially in the US a few years ago, now is becoming mainstream and social media have exploded. So maybe I'll start with you, Marie. Dangers and risks.
No, that's a great point. And obviously ESG is going mainstream. And it's in large part, Laurent, because it deals with critical business issues and resources such as code of conduct, ethics, health and safety, human capital. Water management is very critical. Product safety, obviously, from a globalization. And then obviously you think about US companies and companies globally, board accountability and executive pay. So I think some of the dangers around that is making sure we think about the product safety and the life cycle of the product and how it impacts various constituents, not only in poorer communities, but in all communities across the globe. And you think about the aspect of how that relates to digitization, as you mentioned before, I do think it's imperative for companies to develop a robust data privacy, cybersecurity, and data breach aspect. But I think, when we think about globalization and some of the risks, you think about the pandemic that just happened and how quickly it spread globally. And our company, for example, travel was a huge part of what we did because, as Lulu said, you had to think globally but act locally. So for every food service customer, whether it's a new cafeteria in a headquarters, whether it's a new hospital build, whether it's a brand new stadium that we have the job, we really have to be there locally to design, project manage, bring the product in, install the product, service the product after, and even sometimes lease the product to the various owners of those projects. So the pandemic, as you know, is one risk and one danger, and it has a devastating impact. So for example, you think about travel, and I used to travel a lot. I was a diamond medallion on Delta. And you think in 2019, there were over 4.5 billion passengers who traveled by airline. And the pandemic really decreased that to less than half. And so globalization really has altered the way we live because we earn a livelihood by our trade and our travel. And you've seen a rise in urbanization as well as the world got really much closer from an economic standpoint, the closer integration. You see in terms of mobility and healthcare systems, and you see the magnitude that this has had on the airline, the cruise industry, as well as hospitality. All the hotels closed. So our business was severely impacted. I remember I was on a call back in June of last year with the CEO of Delta, Ed Bastian, and the CEO of American Express. And the CEO of American Express is saying, my business is down, 50% based on the impact of COVID. And Ed Bastian from Delta said, you're in good company. Our volume is down over 95%.
Exactly.
So, major airlines, they've implemented travel bans. And so you've seen many cases, from an international tourism perspective, impact resulting in layoffs and affecting livelihood of employees. You also see the food chain and the supply chain, as I mentioned, being impacted, and you see a heavy burden on the healthcare sector. So I think globalization really has some positive, but also negative because this spread so quickly. So you see lockdown measures, Laurent, they also increased teleworking and telecommuting, but they've really impacted supply and demand. It canceled operations, social distancing has really impacted like the Summer Olympics, it's impacted athletic games, and you have sort of a hybrid in-person work in classes, even in the universities. So what we've seen from that, we've also seen major shortages in high demand supplies like face masks, sanitizer, and paper products. We couldn't get face masks for the first 3 months.
I know.
Then when we bought, it was such a flood to the market, it really impacted pricing. So that really was an impact as well. And so the other thing, Laurent, just what then that did was really push the digitization, as you mentioned, and really improved e-commerce. E-commerce grew to nearly, even in the US, to nearly 840 billion. That's staggering. That's a 41% growth rate from 20.
Amazing, yeah?
Yeah, amazing. In the last 20 years, it's been the highest. So that, the globalization has led to easily more pandemics transferring, but also has led to many other positive and negative, as I just mentioned. And ESG, I think, wrapping that back, is an important aspect that each of us as leaders in the company and on the board really have to really work through to make sure that those risks and dangers don't impact not only our company, but our economy for the long term.
Thank you very much, Mary. Very good. I think Filippo and I coming from Europe, know that ESG has been really a major thing in Europe for the past 10 years, and we started by looking at it with carefully, because is it constraints? But in fact, it's bringing a lot of pluses. And I'm reminded that we don't have much more time. And I think you've covered this risk and dangers very well, Maria. Maybe a couple of words, Lulu and Filippo, about risk dangers, and maybe each of you, to conclude one tip about how to manage globalization.
I'll just very quickly say that I think when you're looking at ESG, and especially in foreign countries, you really, the challenge is the very different standards that are applied in even in one market. And you have to look at the standards from the consumer safety panels, and then there are different government agencies, and then there's the legal courts. And then most importantly, there's the court of public opinion. Because in this world of social media, you can be tried and hanged very quickly in social media, and your reputation destroyed, reputation built up over decades. So you have to be very mindful. And I remember not too long ago, maybe 2016, there was the tainted Maggi noodles in India, and it caused a huge firestorm in the social media. And it was very confusing because the courts were saying one thing and the consumer safety panels were saying something else. And I think you need to have a management that's really sensitive and responsive. And end of the day, it was won in the court of public opinion, even as the courts were still battling it out. But you respond quickly, you show you care, you're sorry, and you try to correct the problem as quickly as possible, not hide from it. So this is the right way to respond in the kind of markets we live in right now. Social media is very, very powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and then
absolutely.
A quick tip. End of the day, it's down to management. When you're investing hundreds of and thousands of miles away, you really need to have management you can depend on, with a great team, and obviously a sustainable business model, but a great sensitivity to change.
Thank you very much, Lulu. And Filippo?
Great, thanks, Laurent. No, I think I would agree with all comments made. ESG is really of paramount importance, really globally, and just thinking of it has been said, but the models developed in the developed countries, if transferred to countries like India and China, would lead to an economic catastrophe. So really the need to push for technological innovation and to look for different models for sustainable economic growth. And as for the tip, is really to use global collaboration to address global challenges. I really think the work that has been done for vaccines for COVID has been fantastic, with global collaboration. And I really, hope that in addressing an even bigger challenge like climate change, there is going to be even greater global collaboration.
Okay, thank you. And Mary, do you have a tip before we conclude?
Yes, of course, Laurent. I think the tip would be the importance of the customer and really ensuring that we have local teams, delivering for the local market. So make it local would be my tip.
Okay, very good. Well, I think we've gone a little bit over time, but I hope we will be excused. Thank you so much to the three of you. It's a pleasure. I hope my sincere hope is that we meet in person in the not so distant future. I know I will meet Lulu anyway at the board sometime, but Mary and Filippo in London, in New York, wherever.
Thank you, Laurent. I look forward.
Thank you very
much, Laurent.
Really
It's
appreciate
great
it.
fun to talk with all of you. Bye-bye, Marie. Bye-bye, Filippo.
Bye, Marie. Bye, Lulu.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
See you soon.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.
Experiencing globalization is a privilege because not everyone has been on a plane. Not everyone has had the opportunity to work with people who are different from them.
Globalization means that an Israeli can live in New York, teach EMBA Global in London, wake up in the morning not knowing what continent I'm on, and then realize it actually does not matter.
Globalization to me represents social connectedness. I think it's easy to think of us, especially today, as feeling more isolated than ever before. But in many ways, what the pandemic and our current state of the world have revealed to us is that our means of connecting to information and to each other has never really been more resilient.
I'm Dawn Kissy, a business journalist, entrepreneur, and current Knight Bagehot Fellow here at Columbia Business School. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today with Professor Amit Khandelwal, who is the Jerome A. Chazen Professor of Global Business at the school. Professor Khandelwal is also a senior scholar with the school's Chazen Institute, where his research focuses on emerging markets and global business. He has explored globalization, protectionism, and its impact on a number of developing economies. Today, we'll delve into this trend and discuss the impact on what global trade has and what, if anything, should be done to reverse it. Professor Khandelwal, welcome.
Thanks so much, Don. It's good to see you.
Where do you see the new US administration moving on trade? They're obviously not going to move too quickly. We've got the Paris Agreement, we've got the TPP. He's got so many things to confront right now. But in terms of global trade, the huge elephant in the room is US, China, US. Where is that relationship going? And what do you feel needs to be implemented in terms of policy and potential full-on reforms to kind of rein this relationship in to the point where it doesn't send the whole world into a tailspin? You got the two biggest economies going head to head. It can't be good for the rest of the world. So I wanted to know what your thoughts are on potential new policy and in what direction they should move in.
So it's a great question. So, but let me take a one step back and talk about the U.S.-China trade war, and then that'll be a good way to think about what the Biden administration is likely to do. Okay, so where we sit today is kind of enmeshed in a trade war between the two largest economies in the world. What are these numbers? What are the size of the numbers involved? Well, in 2018, when the U.S. imposed tariffs on China, and not just China, but also other trade partners, we ended up imposing tariffs on about 20% of our imports, so $420 billion. And the tariffs on those imports that were targeted go up about 20%. Okay, so think about it as that like a sales tax going up by 20%. And this is pretty pervasive across the economy. The U.S. tracks 25,000 goods that come in through the borders every year, and we've imposed a tariff increase on about 70,000 of those. And so by some of the analysis that I've done, this is probably the largest return to protectionism that the U.S. has kind of experienced since the Great Depression. And our trade partners didn't sit silent, so they end up imposing tariffs on U.S. exports. So the $133 billion worth of U.S. exports are targeted by tariffs mostly by China, but also other countries as well. It's about 9% of U.S. exports. Tariffs are going up by about 15%. And I spent quite a bit of time over the past couple of years trying to get a handle on what this kind of very large increase in protectionism has done to the U.S. economy. And one of the things I've realized in discussing this with in the classroom has been that I think historically, if you ask business leaders to think about the types of risks that they face, kind of big macro risks, they often talk about interest rates, for instance. And interest rate risk is something that people really, really understand or have a good handle on because the FOMC meets 8 times a year, and it's talked a lot about in the news. And what I noticed that when the tariffs came raining down, there was a lot of uncertainty about both what that means to the economy and how the tariffs actually propagate. And so it's useful maybe to spend a little bit of time, just a moment, to kind of spelling out how a tariff actually affects an economy. Sure. So what is it? What is a tariff? A tariff you can think about as a tax on an imported good. When the U.S. imposes a tax on an imported good, in principle, consumers should be worse off. So imagine you're importing a good for $100. The U.S. government imposes a tariff of 20%. That should make U.S. consumers better off. It's actually not immediately clear that that's always going to be the case, because if I'm the importer of the good and my government's imposing a 20% tariff on the Chinese import that I'm buying, I might go to my Chinese supplier and say, no, lower your price down to $80 so that when I apply the tariff, it's back to basically $100. And for all of 2018 and 2019, essentially, the Trump administration was basically saying that was what was going on, that the Chinese or the foreign partners were quote unquote eating the tariff. Mm-hmm. And so this came down to just an empirical question when we looked at the data, which is to see what was happening at the prices of the border when you impose this tariff. And it turned out that effectively the price of $100 was not changing at all, so that when you impose the tariff of 20%, the tariff inclusive cost of this product was $120. So really, during this trade war, what this analysis has shown, it's been shown in other papers as well, is that the U.S. consumer is really taking it on the chin as a result of these tariffs. Now, the flip side of that, so there's kind of one effect of the trade war is that U.S. consumers, particularly the consumers of imported goods, are going to be worse off.
Sure.
Right? Now, who's going to be why are we imposing the tariffs? There should be some gain somewhere. Who's going to gain? Well, it's going to be the producers, the domestic producers, who are likely to gain, because now the imported goods are becoming more expensive. How much they gain kind of depends on a few factors. How substitutable is the Chinese good with the good that I produce? If it's very substitutable, that's going to be great for me as a domestic producer, because the prices of Chinese good has just gone up $20, and so everyone's going to flock to my good. On the other hand, maybe I'm using Chinese inputs to produce my good, and so now my costs are going up, right? So that's going to kind of blunt the effect of the producers. And at the same time, my foreign trade partners, China in particular, may be imposing a tariff on the product that I actually make. So now, whereas I was selling it to more Chinese consumers, they may be less interested in buying, for the same reason that the U.S. consumers are less interested in buying imported goods in a trade war. So
hugely helpful. This is really helpful. And I really like how you've delved into tariffs. I want to pivot a little bit and talk more about your research. I know that you've focused on certain areas as a senior scholar with Chazen. What are you looking at right now? And what do you think the implications could be if widespread research or even finite research on globalization and trade were to come out even in a month from now? Do you think the Biden administration would leap on your research? Tell us about your findings.
Yeah, so when you try to tally up what the overall effect of the trade war is, you have consumers, producers, and government revenue. What we end up finding is that the U.S. economy lost about $25 billion worth as a result of the trade war, and that number masks a pretty large loss to U.S. consumers. That's where U.S. producers and government revenue are taking up, kind of offsetting some of the loss. And so that's a $25 billion loss to the U.S. economy, which I think is a self-inflicted wound to some extent, because, to the extent that you think that jobs are going to come back as a result of the trade war, the empirical evidence has shown that employment hasn't gone up in the sectors that received the protection.
And to be clear, you're referring to the U.S. economy.
I'm referring entirely right now to the U.S. economy, and so now, if you think about from the current administration's perspective, I think where the current administration sits is that they're likely to be cautious. I think one thing that the Trump administration was very, very instrumental in doing is changing the debate about tariffs. It used to be the case that politicians from both parties were roughly in agreement on a general free trade strategy that the U.S. Pursues, and I think the Trump administration was very effective in changing the nature of that debate. So I expect that the current administration will be pretty cautious on lifting of the tariffs, particularly with respect to China, because they may be holding the Chinese tariffs in the cards for a grander strategy of that would include not just the economic consequences of kind of deteriorating relationships, but also the political consequences.
Okay. So, Professor, what do you think the big takeaway is from your current research at the Chazen Institute?
So I think the the big takeaway is that the tariffs, I think, were a self-inflicted wound on the U.S. economy for the stated objectives of what the administration was hoping to get out of the tariffs. I don't think have been materialized, and we've seen price increases and a general loss to the U.S. economy as a result of the tariffs. At the same time, I think the bigger thing, which I haven't quantified, but I truly think is important, is I think we've lost a lot of goodwill amongst our allies and trade partners as a result of the trade war. And this has come through a variety of ways, in particular the way in which the US has dealt with the World Trade Organization in the past couple of years. And I worry that even if the Biden administration is able to make some commitments towards a more integrated global economy, the worry that I have is that trade partners will say, well, this is likely to last only 4 years, and a new administration would immediately roll it back. And so I think that's one of the reasons that I think maybe the major takeaway is that the uncertainty that the trade war has kind of pushed into the global economy, I think, is likely to be quite high for some time as of.
Sure, makes perfect sense. And when you talk about the possibility of this being rolled back, it all circles back to one big issue many people on the global stage, raised concerns about, was U.S. credibility. Can we trust the U.S. on this? Can we trust the U.S. on that? And when it comes to U.S.-China, can we trust them on this? So it's really interesting, and I'm sure myself and everyone in the CBS community are looking forward to more findings from your research. Thank you so much, Professor Khandelwal.
Thank you.
Every day, the global marketplace is changing. The change could be anywhere. Trade barriers are coming up or going down. One country's economy is booming, while another's is barely holding on. There's huge opportunity out there in the global marketplace, but it's hard to make sense of all the information that's coming in and what to do with it. A vital part of what a business school does is to provide access and insight to students and professionals who are the global players in the marketplace today and tomorrow. You need access to the experts who can really help you understand how to break into new markets. And you need insight into the cultural and economic environment in which you'll be operating. And you need to be looking ahead. New research and new strategies are springing up every day. And that's what we do at the Chazen Institute for Global Business. From presenting talks with world business leaders, to funding important research, to organizing student study tours to dozens of countries, we live and breathe global business. Insight and access. That's what the Chazen Institute provides, and that's what it takes to succeed in the global marketplace.
Insight and access, indeed. And I can think of no person better to bring us to the intersection of the global economy, global business, and global politics than Bob Zoellick. Bob has had a very distinguished career in economic policymaking, from the Treasury Department in the Reagan years to Undersecretary of State in the first Bush administration, to the U.S. Trade Representative, where we served together in President George W. Bush's administration, then president of the World Bank, and now a research scholar at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's an author many times, but most recently of a book I would commend to all of you, America in the World. For me, it's personal. He's a very thoughtful colleague and friend. After Bob's remarks, he and I will have a short conversation. Be sure to send me your questions and I'll fold them in. Bob, thank you so much for being here. Over to you.
Well, Glenn, I'm pleased to be with you. And for the audience, I know you've had a full measure of globalization today. So perhaps you might understand my hesitancy when my friend Glenn invited me to speak on the topic. Nevertheless, given my great respect for Glenn as a scholar and as the most effective CEA chairperson as a policymaker that I've encountered, as well as a superb dean, I decided to sign on. So as I reflected on how to offer you a fresh vantage point, I recalled a man named Jeremy Bentham. Bentham, an Englishman, lived at the time of the British Empire of North America, the American and French revolutions, the Napoleonic Wars, and as Henry Kissinger wrote in his Harvard thesis, the European effort to restore world order. Now, important for this audience, Bentham lived at the era when King's College became known as Columbia. So some of you may recall Bentham's name with the association of the idea of utilitarianism. But few people know that Jeremy Bentham coined the term international. Internationalism was the globalization of that age. And like globalization, Bentham introduced internationalism as part of a packet of ideas. They included arms reductions, free commerce, emancipation of colonies, a permanent court to resolve conflicts among nations, and retaining navies only to curb piracies. Alas, Bentham seems to have written a rather nasty anonymous piece on the American Declaration of Independence, which most scholars trace to the fact that he really didn't like Jefferson's idea of natural rights. Now, what almost no one recalls is that Jeremy Bentham had a younger brother, Sir Samuel Bentham. Sir Samuel was a naval architect who revolutionized naval armament and construction. He served for the Russian Tsar. He fought the Turks. He even visited China to get a knowledge about the ship design of junks. And then he returned to London in 1795, where he built the Royal Navy in the age of Nelson. Sadly, opponents of Sir Samuel's reforms eventually forced him to resign in 1812, but he'd done his great duty to help build the Royal Navy that helped win the Napoleonic Wars. Now, taken together, Jeremy and Samuel Bentham represent different strands or aspects of internationalization, the globalization of 200 plus years ago. So the world of 1800 was also a time of intellectual and revolutionary ferment, international commerce, great power conflicts, and disruptions in the world order. So as you consider globalization today, I want to highlight two tensions similar to those experienced by the Bentham brothers. First, the phenomena of globalization, despite the naysayers, remains powerful, even dynamic, although the governance of globalization is fraying, fracturing, and fragmenting. So when I hear people speak about the end of globalization, I have to scratch my head. And here's Exhibit 1, the COVID pandemic. The United States has lost about 525,000 lives. That's more than we lost in World War II, and it's approaching the number that we lost in the Civil War. And virologists believe that the viral breakouts are increasing in frequency and in cost, and it's closely related to the interconnections among wildlife, livestock, and human beings, especially in Southeast Asia and South China. So we certainly need to think of pandemics as a risk to security as well as to health and economics. Or consider whether climate change and other environmental topics are globalization. Or more traditionally, the effects of monetary and fiscal policies on macroeconomic factors and capital flows. Or data flows, the raw material of digital economies that are pulsing through every sector of the economy. The World Economic Forum reported in 2019 that global data flows were overtaking trade flows in economic value. Or cybersecurity. Or then there's food and energy and other global commodity flows, plus oceanic effects, or migrations, even religious movements, plus the security standbys of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. Yet the shocks of the early 21st century have battered national governments, and states have returned increasingly to controls, to reassure publics, to cope with crises, and to reestablish some sense of sovereign power. The internet is now the splinternet, but reactions always breed counter-reactions. The breakdowns in global governance stimulated technological adaptations and new types of connectivity. So the gaps in governance have not just been cases of states striking back. Equally important, the national governments are failing to cooperate and work with the private sector to advance and negotiate standards, rules, and norms of regional and global interconnections. So the governance of globalization, which is always weak, is now deteriorating. So let's look more closely at trade as an example. Since 2007, the increase in trade shifted from roughly 2 times the growth in GDP over the prior decades to below GDP growth. But the growth in trade and services was roughly 60% faster than the manufacturing trade. Even before COVID, supply chains were becoming less reliant on lower labor costs and more linked to digital platforms, relying increasingly on knowledge-intensive workers. Technology shifts, especially 3D printing, raised the prospects of moving from the development of the 1990s of large batches of specialized components assembled over great distances to manufacturing of small, customized batches near the purchaser. And regional trade patterns assumed greater importance. We started to see area concentrations in autos, computers, electronic equipment. And of course, part of this is China's changing demand and production, and this led to especially striking changes across Asia. And although tariffs have been relatively flat since 2005, although as you heard with the prior speaker, the big boost from the US, non-tariff barriers have been rising quite quickly. And the year of COVID has simply accelerated these shifts to digital, data, and cross-border services. We have to expect that more labor services will become tradable. The rules for intellectual property rights, data, and digital services will become even more important. Supply chain managers say that they'll emphasize resiliency and risk management over cost cutting, although I expect that AI will help increase the efficiency of the chains. Blockchain is likely to lessen reliance on third parties to manage transactions and help deal with risk in some parts of the world that might have seemed off bounds to some investors. We'll likely see the development of new infrastructure for platforms and exchange, and of course, older port societies will adapt. And as you've also heard today, sustainability will loom much larger too. So the new combination of trade, technology, data, and finance poses a host of policy issues. Now, in the past, the United States, because it was the leading edge economy, was often the first to press for new rules to support the novel services because it was in the forefront. The Obama administration was listless on trade in its first term before it concentrated on the Trans-Pacific Partnership in its second term, but alas, it was a year too late. In 2015, the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, actually passed the negotiating authority, TPA, through the House with the Republican Congress. I believe if TPP had gotten done in 2015, it would have gotten through the Congress, but they were a year too late. And then, as you've heard, President Trump, of course, reversed course. He turned to managed trade. He tried to target bilateral trade deficits. He trashed the rules. He abandoned the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was all transactional. No attention to the systemic. As the US moved towards protectionism, it intersected with Xi Jinping's turn to strengthen the role of the state in the economy. Slowness in opening up many sectors in the Chinese economy, and the use of trade to bully partners. So ironically, although the US had led in creating the global trading system, and China had relied on that system to achieve a historic economic transformation, both countries, the world's 2 largest economies, were undermining the world order of trade. So now let's turn to the second tension that recalls the world of the Bentham brothers, the strain between great power competition and transnational cooperation. During the Cold War, the United States created a unique system of alliances and a dynamic international market economy. And of course, in the decades after the end of the Cold War in Europe, the United States sought to enlarge that order in areas of security and politics and economics. But the first decades of the 21st century started to erode Americans' faith in their ability to promote that order, with attacks on the homeland, sort of long and frustrating wars, the financial and economic shocks, and uncertainties about how to address the transnational challenges such as climate and pandemics. Now, when Xi Jinping became China's leader in 2012, he created a documentary film about the end of the Soviet Union. and he commanded all the party cadres to view the film. Now, if such a film had been produced in Europe, it would have shown Gorbachev as the hero that helped end the Cold War. Well, the Chinese version is a little different. Gorbachev was the fool who abandoned the Communist Party, led to the ruin of country, and led to its breakup. And Xi's not so subtle message is, it's not going to happen here. So while the end of the Cold War is a historical issue now being studied at Columbia and other universities, it's a very real and live aspects of policy in China. As my friend Evan Feigenbaum, now at the Carnegie Endowment, pointed out, China really pursued a two-track approach to international strategy. On one track, China worked within the existing system to advance its interest, push its norms, advance Chinese into various positions. Now, frankly, this shouldn't have been a shock. Lots of countries do this. The surprise was President Trump's withdrawal and attacks on the multilateral regimes, opening up more opportunities for China. China did have a second track, however, and that was to try to create alternative models based on China's traditional preference for tributary relations. Under a tributary relations model, other states could benefit from China's growth as long as they treated China respectfully, certainly didn't criticize the Chinese leadership. The Belt and Road Project typifies this. You could call this globalization with Chinese characteristics. Now, President Trump stoked anxieties about China, though his haphazard tactics ended up concentrating on a managed trade deal of purchases, which, by the way, was only about half fulfilled. Ironically, the deal actually reinforces China's state controls because it didn't press state reforms. It was the notion of a purchase deal. When COVID-19 imperiled the Trump administration's reelection efforts, his officials moved from the deal-making model to a full-bore confrontation. In my view, they mistook confrontation for competition. They wrapped the package together with the label of great power competition, but they focused primarily on security terms without ideas for regional economic strategy. And I believe they ignored core U.S. economic strengths, the dynamism, innovation, openness, and connection with allies and partners. The United States can never compete with authoritarian countries by figuring out how much we can close down or close off people. Our strength is our openness. A great power contest with zero-sum or even lose-lose calculations also left no room for cooperative action on the transnational security questions, biological security, climate, or the obvious economic interdependence. Now, as you heard just before me, the Biden administration inherited the momentum of the confrontation with China. And they don't want to look soft, as you can see with the reports coming out of the meeting in Alaska. They wanted to focus on allies and partners and building back better at home. They might prefer to try to find some off-ramps to lessen the risks of serious clashes that could escalate. But again, building on the prior session, I think their multilateralism will be hindered by the wariness of the administration to use trade policy to help develop the rules of the future. I think they're repeating the mistake of the Obama first term, where being overly sensitive to domestic protectionist constituencies. And anybody who knows the world of Asia or even how the European Union works knows that trade and economic parts are a key to international policy. So I began with a touch of history, so I'll close with the same. As Glenn knows well, we've had other eras of globalization. The Bentham brothers at the turn of the Age of Discovery and the move from early empires to Britain's rule as a world power. And then we saw another phase in the late 19th, early 20th century with the transformation of transportation, communications costs, the use of the gold standard to give some comfort for exchange rates and finance. That globalization crashed upon the rocks of great power competition in 1914, opening what historians refer to as the short, calamitous 20th century. So as you leave the events today, I suggest you keep in mind that we need to manage tensions across security, economics, technology, and transnational topics. And you have to do that through some form of international process. And it'll be that political process that will shape the world order and globalization in the 21st century. So we'll need the perspective of both the Bentham brothers, Jeremy and Sir Samuel. And so I compliment the Chazen Institute for encouraging the research that's going on, encouraging the constructive ideas, and most importantly, helping to encourage a new generation of younger scholars that will set the standard for this new age of globalization.
Thanks so much, Bob. And it's hard not to love a set of remarks that begin with hearkening back to an old economist. So thanks so much for that. I have some specific questions based on your talk, but I want to start out with a general one. You had several historical allusions, obviously, in your remarks. Why did you write America and the World? What do you think policymakers can learn in general from history as we think about globalization and trade?
Yeah, well, when I was in government, I often drew upon history in thinking through problems. And so at heart, and I wanted to encourage others, especially a next generation, including, as you heard today, the use of economic history as well as traditional geopolitics. Now, many foreign policy courses these days are taught using international relations theory. And for the scholars, they're fun to play with. They show some intellectual sort of agility. But to be frank, when I was dealing with issues such as German unification or development of the World Bank or genocide in Darfur, they tended not to offer too much sort of help. And so the heart of the book is to use chapters that focus on practical problem solving. Now, people in this audience may recall Henry Kissinger wrote a book in the 90s titled Diplomacy, and he used history to talk about foreign policy. But given his perspective, he tended to rely more on the European realpolitik perspective. So I wanted to try to write a book that focused on the American ideas and their experience with the multiplicity and pluralism. And I suppose there's one other aspect that you might have encountered in your government service. I sometimes used to torture my younger colleagues by asking them what they knew about history. You probably asked about their economic knowledge. And because I honestly didn't know. And insofar as I discovered they learned history, it tended to be from World War II on. And the first 150 years have some fascinating people and events that I wanted to bring back from the mists of time. And so I tried to structure the book around stories. I wanted to make it more appealing to readers. In some ways, it's a multiple biography. I had a seminar, I have to admit, Glenn, up at Harvard with some faculty and graduate students, and they kept encouraging me, I think wisely, to include my own assessment. So in addition to telling the stories, I kind of add sort of my comparative advantage of this. And I suppose kind of the last two aspects of it are that I wanted to, in a world where, at least from the outside, it looks like critical studies have seized control of many academies, perhaps not the business school. I wanted to point out that imperfect results in a far from perfect world can still be a good measure. And I wanted to have the idea that history can offer insights on how to do better as opposed to acceptance of timeless obstacles. And the encouraging thing is, as I talked about the book and some professors have started to use it with their classes, I've actually found that students enjoy the idea that you can actually try to address problems and people can get things done.
Well, that's great. I want to pick up on a theme you really hit hard in your remarks about great power competition and transnational cooperation, and think about China and the United States. So there are a variety of ways in which one might imagine those two great economies, these two largest economies in the world, competing. It could be the technology 5G race. It could be regional spheres of influence. You mentioned the battle over TPP, and of course, there's a Chinese successor to that. American leaders sometimes approach this problem of, we wish China would do what we want it to do, or we wish China were more like us. Wishes, of course, aren't a strategy. So how would you think about an economic competition and cooperation strategy with China? Where are there things we're never going to change Chinese views, and where might we find common ground?
So first, of course, this has to start at home. And we'll see how the legislation works out. But for those looking for some positive sense of bipartisanship. There's an act that Chuck Schumer, the Democrat of New York, has proposed with Todd Young, Republican of Indiana, called the Endless Frontier Act. And I take special pride in this because one of my chapters is about a man named Vannevar Bush, who was the founder of American science policy after World War II. And his report was called About Science, the Endless Frontier, which I know Senator Young had some familiarity with. So, and of course, beyond that, it's kind of keeping the United States open, dynamic. As I sort of alluded to in my remarks, I understand concerns about espionage, but I think it's crazy to cut off American universities from foreign students. It's the best advertisement that we have. And in general, our strength, if you think about so much of the innovative companies in America come from immigrants. So we want to try to be an open system. Secondly, the United States, going back to the experience from 1947-49, has always been more effective if it does so with allies and partners. This is kind of a big gap in the Trump approach. And you can see the Biden administration trying to do that. Now, sometimes people assume that we can just tell these other parties what to do. I sort of work closely with President Bush 41 and Secretary Baker, and part of their genius of alliance management was focusing on the most important objectives and being able to compromise on some of the others. And then as you come to the issue of China, I think one unfortunate part of the sort of the wave of debate is that there's a new conventional wisdom that cooperation with China failed. And I see an article almost every day on this. And that's just historically totally wrong. I mean, not only on issues of sanctions with Iran or UN Security Council sanctions, but certainly on the economic side. As you know, in the global financial crisis, China had sort of the best stimulus response. It actually moved its current account to zero. It quit manipulating its exchange rate. It was the fastest growing destination for US exports for 15 years until the Trump administration. Now, my point is not to say that all is well, but as you know, in the economics field, it's different sometimes the way security people think. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum calculation. You can find a sort of mutual interest here. And there was a good article actually written by a young professor now at the University of Oregon that in the most recent Foreign Affairs that talked about the WTO experience and explained how actually the WTO accession sort of worked with reformist movements, helped make change in the process of China. Now, you've got people from the asset management industry as sort of part of your group. And you obviously, if you're BlackRock or if you're sort of Bridgewater or others today, you have to see yourself as getting involved in the asset management market and the bond market in China, in part because of different correlations in the growth. And of course, from the Chinese side, they want to move towards more institutional investors, greater liquidity, so you can see them opening up the market. And there are countless examples of, I found, that where you could, the Chinese, as you know, technocrats are very sophisticated people and sort of trying to understand the common interests. And I'll give you one that is in today's news that also would suggest that while the U.S. can work, it can also use leverage. So as you know, there's a debate about an additional SDR allocation for the IMF to help developing countries. And we could have a discussion about whether that's the most efficient way to do so. But if the U.S. is going to move forward on SDRs, what I would have done if I were Secretary Yellen is I would approach Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the IMF, and said, I might be able to get the U.S. to be able to move on this, but I need something in return. And China has a very large debt buildup, and it's willing, in developing countries, particularly Africa, it's willing to restructure its Ex-Im debt, but not its China Development Bank debt, which it asserts are more like commercial bank debt. So I would say to Kristalina, look, if you could get the Chinese to agree to restructure some of the China Development Bank debt, maybe I can move on the IMF issue, or the SDR issue. And it's a good example of how you could do well and do good at the same time, but you have to be willing to use your leverage on some of these issues. And I find in many cases, if you think about the Chinese economic problems, as you know well, and the people at your institute know, they're not 10 feet tall. They've got a lot of problems along the way here. And certainly then if you take this to the issues of climate or biological security, we have a common interest here in working on these issues. So at heart, I think one of the problems is that we're kind of left with this hostile attitude from the Trump administration that allows people to pound their chests and say, oh, I'm going to be tough on China. From my years of experience across many administrations, the real game is kind of what results do you have? And sort of, I don't frankly see showing strength by just sort of bludgeoning the other guy. I mean, to be honest, Hamilton had, since we're talking about economic history, had a wonderful line that was they said, strut is worthless. He said, sort of moderation in manner and, firmness in the thing. And I kind of like that sort of overall approach. And I'll close with one last word on this. Of course, the United States should always stand for its openness as a society. I question sometimes whether just sort of endless sanctioning of people is the right way to approach this. If I would take Hong Kong, for example, and clearly the Chinese are ending the Hong Kong system, but my response would be like Britain had done, which is to say, let's open up opportunities for green cards for people from Hong Kong to come to the United States. What better way would there be to show the difference between a free and an unfree society? So I think there's a lot of work that can be done. At the same time, we have to recognize where we have differences to manage and certain policies in the security area of deterrence.
Those are great answers. I want to pull at a couple of threads of what you brought up. One is about the World Trade Organization, because as your remarks suggested, there was a long evolution of the WTO from the original General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, modifications. We go to the World Trade Organization. Now we have our present struggles. The rules of the WTO aren't particularly well suited for China meeting literal requirements of the WTO. China's nominally part of it, but doesn't really obey by all those rules. What rules should the U.S. be flexible on in the WTO? And or when should we ask, maybe the WTO is not the right structure? Do you have any reform thoughts in mind?
So just a starting point. I go to a lot of sessions and people say, this country is violating the rules. And sometimes I have the temerity to ask, well, which rule is that? And of course, they often have just, it's our rule or our assumption. And, if you're going to try to hold people to rules, you probably end up having to negotiate them. It turns out China actually was pretty good in compliance with the quantitative requirements. And just to put this in perspective, it lowered its barriers much lower than other developing countries like India and Brazil and others. It was on areas like enforcing intellectual property rights, that's where the problem arose. But just to come back to sort of your example, as China has moved up the technology curve, it has its own interest in enforcing intellectual property rights. And the data that I had was that it created special intellectual property rights courts in a number of cities. They're deciding for foreigners about 85 to 90% of the time, but the penalties are too low. So I'd be negotiating higher penalties. So coming back in terms of the WTO, first, I think success breeds success. So I would focus first on some modest gains, for example, dealing with restrictions on exports of health equipment. And I would focus on sort of environmental goods and services. Frankly, there's actually an article about sort of overuse of fisheries in today's, I think, Wall Street Journal. If fisheries subsidies could be negotiated away. But those are to try to start to rebuild some sense of accomplishment. Over time, Glenn, first off, you now have, I think, about 164 economies. Under the MFN, Most Favored Nation principle, if you grant a liberalization to one, you grant it to all. You're going to have to move to a pluralistic model where it starts to become coalitions of the willing. Now, and you should develop those rules and create opportunities for others to join, whether it's data or information technology or other issues. There's another sort of question, particularly related to China, which is the rules on state-owned enterprises. And if people look actually at the US-Singapore FTA, which I negotiated many years ago, you'll find there's actually a series of requirements because of the state-owned enterprises in Singapore for sort of competitive neutrality. Some of those are carried forward to the TPP and they could sort of be added to. And you'll find you can get some international support on doing that. At the same time, this is where the difficulty when you actually deal with people who aren't just from your system. You know, if we're talking about subsidies, somebody might want to look at U.S. farm subsidies because many people think, well, we're subsidizing our farm sector. So, you know, sometimes this goes two ways. And then there's an issue that has plagued the WTO over the past 20 years called special and differential treatment, which is the idea that developing countries that make fewer contributions, that have to make fewer commitments. To be honest, I'm not sure I'd hit this head on because it just becomes sort of an ideological debate. I would deal with it practically in terms of trying to emphasize if countries want to get benefits, they have to sort of take some of these actions. So I could see a combination of a longer term structural agenda, but also some quick wins. And I guess the one other point is, you know, it actually started in the Obama administration, as you probably know, Glenn, that the United States started to hold off the appointment of the appellate body members. I don't like to call them judges because it really isn't a judicial system. And then the Trump administration, of course, blocked the system by refusing to support additional nominees. Interestingly enough, the European Union and many other countries went ahead and they created sort of a parallel system, which is a reminder, as American business people knows, that just because we want to shut things down means that everybody else will stop. But I would suspect that given the reality of politics, the U.S. would be wise to try to get back in the system, but also negotiate a little flexibility for political safety valves. So you may know this, Glenn. I tried something called a safeguard as opposed to anti-dumping and countervailing duty suits early in the Bush administration with steel, and I got my head handed to me. But the logic was basically, rather than use these anti-dumping and countervailing duty suits, which, as you know, economists sort of consider sort of not at all sort of appropriate to what economics would suggest, it's better for countries to acknowledge that they need a period where they're going to have an adjustment and kind of be transparent about it for an industry like steel. And this is an interesting case because the WTO decisions restricted the safeguard rules, so you really couldn't use it in that fashion. So this would be an example, or you may want to expand it. So as in many of these, if you're thinking about the WHO, the WTO, World Bank, or others, you need something that brings people along. You have to recognize the structural shift, but you also have to have an eye for package solutions.
I want to come back to the domestic breathing space argument in a minute, but one other follow-up on China. You referred both to TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and to the Belt and Road Initiative. Should the U.S. try to jump back in some way? Is that even feasible? And or do we need our own version of Belt and Road?
So let's take individually with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the U.S. negotiated with 11 other economies, and then the U.S. dropped out under Trump. And again, you know, it's common now for people to say, "Oh well, Hillary Clinton wouldn't have supported it." That's possible, but as I said, you know, I think if Obama, you know, had gotten it done in 7 years as opposed to 8 years, you would have seen it pass the Republican Congress. So this shows sort of the practical steps that I talk about in my book about combining, you know, politics with your diplomacy or economics. I would like to see the United States rejoin the TPP. You've got Britain making noises about the TPP. You've got actually the Chinese even acting as if they would sort of like to proceed. And by the way, that would require some big adjustments on some of the state-owned enterprises rules. I think politically it'd be very difficult. And so in my practical sense, Glenn, you know, if I were running the trade policy now, I'd be focusing much more on the digital economy. I made some allusions to this in my remarks. But when you look at the numbers, this is just, you know, was moving quite significantly, and now COVID has just accelerated it. And we don't really have common approaches that, whether it's for data interconnectivity and sort of the localization requirements, you basically want to allow some exchange of data in an efficient way while allowing countries to have the privacy and security requirements that they feel they need to have. So I would probably try to do that in an East Asian context to show that we're in the game. The other idea that I've had is that I think Americans have not focused as much on how Britain will really change after Brexit. And I think we have a long-term strategic interest in Britain being a global player. And so I propose that we have a North American UK trade agreement. And one of the ideas was the rewrite of NAFTA, the USMCA, as you know, had labor provisions in it, quite extensive. Well, it's hard for me to believe that Britain couldn't meet sort of whatever our union's labor standards are. And by the way, this could be a great opportunity to come up with some of the cutting edge rules for topics like digital or environmental or health or other areas. So I'm looking for ways to move the agenda forward. Given my view about the importance of North America as a unit, I would try to do it in a North American context. And frankly, I've discussed this with some Republican members of the Senate because the Trade Promotion Authority expires, and they said, look, we'd be willing to extend it for a UK deal. But this is where I make my larger point. I'm a little worried that the Biden administration feels it can be multilateral without trade, and I think it will discover eventually that this comes a cropper. As for the Belt and Road, I mean, I think there's kind of in-between positions. You may recall the Chinese came up with the idea of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in the course of the Obama administration. And a lot of people opposed it. I didn't. I said, look, it depends on kind of what the governance and rules and transparency are. And I made the observation that when I was in government, we often had people from other countries saying the U.S. should do this and do that, and the U.S. should come up with the money. I don't object if other people come up with money as long as we've got the rules straight. And interestingly enough, the head of the Asian Infrastructure Bank, who had worked at the Asian Development Bank, hired a bunch of people from the World Bank, and they came up with good governance rules and anti-corruption rules and procurement rules and other things like that. And so, and they do a lot of co-financing with the World Bank. So these things, this is an example of sort of the win-win. On the Belt and Road, there's two approaches. One is obviously the United States would be better off if we can also support sort of investment in other countries. I don't, I'm still perhaps a little old school, Glenn, on saying we don't have to subsidize all this. I think that a lot of it is sort of getting the rules right and creating the right sort of conditions. But I'll give you another practical example on Belt and Road. When China had a few years ago its China Development Forum and was celebrating 40 years of economic reforms, they invited me to speak. And I said, look, here's how Asian Infrastructure Bank was well received. And look at how Belt and Road is being questioned. And people don't know, is it a geopolitical venture? Is it to use excess capacity? Is it, a development venture? It's probably all of those. I said, so why don't you take the principles that you used for the Asian development, the Asian Infrastructure Bank, transparency, anti-corruption, procurement, why don't you apply those to Belt and Road? And the head of the People's Bank of China, who you know, Yi Gang, actually said, look, we've given your speech to Xi, and the next year, Xi gives a form of my speech. Now, at that point, what the United States and others should have done is said, okay, nice words, how do we make sure? How do we operationalize this? How do we focus on these issues? This is an example of where I think you can show there's win-win possibilities while recognizing it's a different sort of political system.
I want to take you back inward and mention a moment, because you mentioned domestic breathing space. Both the Obama administration and the Trump administration in different ways were doing this for domestic producers. But there's another way of thinking about breathing space, which is how do you help people who are left behind, whether it's by technological change, which is the bigger global force, or globalization and trade itself. Any ideas there in the policy process? I've always felt that if we want to really bolster support for globalization, and for that matter, technological change, we have to make sure that more people are included in its benefits. Any ideas on that kind of domestic breathing space?
Yeah, and this will become very important, Glenn, because, for example, Catherine Tai, who was just confirmed as the new U.S. Trade Representative, when asked by Senator Toomey, it was your job to kind of open markets, and she said, well, not necessarily. And she said, it's it's the focus on workers. Well, which workers? the farmers who export most of their product? I mean, the difference between $15 bushel soybean and $5 bushel is basically opening up foreign markets. Is the fact that export workers earn about 20% more because they're more productive? Or are we going to try to protect the old industries? So it's a nice politically appealing sort of answer, but it doesn't really get you very far as to what you're going to accomplish. And of course, this brings us to the issue, which both you and I have focused on, which is I do think you have to help people adapt to change, and you have to be willing to, allow them to be more mobile, that deals with everything from their health care to their sort of pension support. And I think increasingly, as I mentioned in my remarks, you're going to find service sector workers also become sort of part of the international trading system. And so you have to help workers be able to adjust. And frankly, particularly for this private sector audience, you know, the government record on this is so-so at best. I think you're going to find more and more needs for the private sector to sort of take this on. And you've seen some big companies figure out, you know, they need to tell their workforce, look, these are the jobs going away. These are the jobs that are going to be created. Kind of what are the skill sets and how can we actually work with educational institutions, perhaps using certifications and other aspects to sort of help people adjust to change. So that clearly, that combination, education, skills, private sector connectivity, will be part of kind of the United States' sort of future. And again, you know, this is where I also referenced how technology keeps adapting. You know, Glenn, I certainly wouldn't claim myself to be a sort of advanced technologist, but I've tried to have some contacts with Silicon Valley and other issues. And it's just striking to see, you know, what gets created, the adaptability, the focus. And I think we could tap some of this in terms of what we need in terms of skills development and training. So it goes back to my principal thesis is, you know, America's trump card is our openness to goods, capital, ideas, people. Like any other country, we don't always get everything right, but if you're open to competition and new people and ideas, you figure out your mistakes earlier, which actually gives us an advantage, I think, over China or authoritarian systems. But frankly, for the past 4 years, we moved away from that concept of openness. And I hope you can see a partial move back, but as I've noted on the trade side, they need prodding.
Now, you mentioned Catherine Tai. So let's take a team of Catherine Tai. Let's throw in Secretary of State Blinken. Let's throw in Secretary of Treasury Yellen and other colleagues. What's your biggest piece of advice for them in thinking about America's role in globalization and drawing on your interest in history, economic, political, or social? What's a spot-on example you'd have them focus on? But besides, of course, buying multiple copies of America in the World.
Well, you know, again, I'll start out with a practical political sense. When my boss of many years, James Baker, was chief of staff with Ronald Reagan, he said to President Reagan in 1981, Mr. President, you have 3 priorities: economic recovery, and economic recovery. So now Biden has got economic recovery and pandemic recovery. And so, not surprisingly, that's their prime focus. And you and others have observed the politics of that with the $1.9 trillion act. They weren't going to err on the small side. There'll be some bigger long-term questions about that, but I think the execution of that will now be very, very important. Secondly, because of that the president has a very full plate. On top of that, you add immigration, you add sort of climate change, you add sort of racial issues. It's natural that the foreign policy could connect with some of the domestic policy. And you know, look at how the administration with this quad group with India and Japan and Australia focused on bringing India in with sort of with the vaccine development. I'm glad to see we're trying to do a little bit more with Mexico and Canada these days. I'm a little worried at their early steps on the immigration issue. This could sort of blow up on them, but and then you could see on the climate and biological security issues, this is a natural to focus on with some of your allies and sort of rebuild partnerships. Having said this, you can't lose sight of the traditional security issues. And, you know, Harold Macmillan had a comment when he was reelected prime minister in Britain, asked about his plans, and he said, "Events, dear boy, events." And I never totally like that because I believe it's important to have a framework and a strategy, but there's something to that, how you're going to react to the events going forward. So where I would bring it home is the topic we've talked about, Glenn, which is I think it's very hard to have a multilateralism unless you have trade in the forefront. And I'm a little concerned about that basically the Democratic constituencies, combined with the fact that they've got to manage, sort of keep the coalition together for the legislative program, will lead them to backpedal on trade and come up with nice phrases like, oh, well, we're here to protect the workers and so on and so forth. Well, we just said, which workers, which farmers, how are you preparing for the future? And it goes back to a point I kind of drew out early in the book. Many people, of course, know about Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence, and John Adams was on that committee. What they don't know is John Adams chaired his own committee, which was the Model Treaty of 1776. And if you look at that treaty, it was a trade agreement. That's what it was about. And what was behind that was not just trade as economic efficiency, but it was a prime contact with the rest of the world. And recognized in an era of empires and mercantilism, it was opening the role for private sector actors. So whether they be missionaries or business people or engineers or soldiers of fortune, that's been one of America's sort of greatest strengths. But in the environment which we just described of tension, of governance of globalization with the reality of it, the United States needs to be pressing forward with a framework in which we can use the genius of our private sector.
I couldn't agree more, and that is a wonderful place to leave it with strategy, mind the events, look in as well as out, and openness is a great hallmark. And who can't like somebody who quoted Alexander Hamilton, a great Columbia University, or at least King's College graduate. So Bob Zoellick, thank you so much for joining us at the conference.
Thanks for inviting me, Glenn, and thanks for the Chazen Institute for all they're doing for the future on these.
What do we do as a university that is committed to global education and helping address global challenges?
We can provide people and places around the world to help our students and faculty to experience that new world.
If we do this right, we really are changing the course of Columbia and perhaps higher education more broadly.
Columbia will be, I have no doubt, the most global of any university in the world.
Let's get out there. Let's build the infrastructure. Let's create the incentives and let's see where it takes us.
It is a real treat to welcome to this 30th anniversary conference for the Chazen Institute at Columbia Business School, Henry Kravis. Henry doesn't need any introduction to this group or but I will just offer three quick personal reflections. First, and obviously, Henry Kravis is a pioneer in the private equity business, having built one of the successful engines of growth for our economy and the world's economy. He's also an inspiration in terms of integrity for leaders at his own firm and in other firms, and also a very generous philanthropist throughout the community and the world, including very importantly at Columbia Business School. So Henry, thanks so much for joining today.
Nice to be with you, Glenn. Thank you for asking me to do this.
I want to start close to home at KKR. So how do you assess global opportunities at KKR, which I believe turns 45 this year? Do you think of yourself as looking for local champions, for tuck-in acquisitions for global companies, or just best-in-class players to build out globally? How do you think about it?
Well, over the years, we're now almost 45 years old as a firm, and a lot obviously has changed during that 45-year period. Our approach from day one, there's a couple things that have been very consistent with us, and one of them is we're long-term investors who like to partner with leading companies. And what used to be where we had to buy control of a company, today we may be a minority but significant owner of a company. We may be able to provide credit for a particular company. Also, we have a focus on real estate infrastructure, and we have a capital markets business. So we have expanded dramatically from a a domestic two-office U.S. firm to today we've got about 22 offices around the world. We have about 2,400 employees around the world today. And there's not any one thing that says this is what we're going to do. I want to give you a little bit of insight into our DNA at KKR, which is our culture. And the culture is very simple. When we started the firm, we made a decision that we wanted everyone to be paid off of one balance sheet so that everyone would help each other and work very closely together. There's no one running around and saying, that's my idea, that's my deal, but rather, if you're paid off the balance sheet, you'll help each other and you really will work together. Having said that, now that we're in these different businesses that I just mentioned to you, when we go to see a company, what used to be about the second sentence, the team would ask the CEO, is your company for sale? And when the CEO would say, well, thank you very much, the answer is no, they didn't know what to talk about. Today, it's an approach that's totally different. It's an approach of what can we do to help you in your company. It may be you need equity capital to help you grow. You want to make an acquisition. It could mean that you want to refinance your balance sheet because the banks aren't necessarily covering you the way you would like to be covered. It could be that you have excess real estate that you would like to either put into a separate entity or to sell it and lease it back. There's lots of things that can be done. And when you connect that to our one firm DNA and our one firm culture, today what is happening is once we get to know the company, we're able to do a lot of things. So when our team goes in to talk to any executive at a company, they have a toolbox with them with different tools in there that may be used for whatever is needed at the particular company. And this is true around the world. It doesn't matter whether you're operating in Australia or operating in China, US, anywhere in Europe, etc. We work together and we try to get the best expertise within the firm, use our global network and the experience that comes from working in different industry groups.
Does it change the way you manage KKR, being a global operation as opposed to starting US only? Does it change your management structure in any way?
Used to be a lot easier, obviously, when we were all in the more or less the same time zone, 3-hour difference, as opposed to 13 hours or 14 or 15 hours, depends where we might be talking. So yes, it's different. So the way we look at this is you have to think globally, but act locally. And it's said all the time, but we really do that here. You cannot have Japanese people operating in China, just like you can't have Chinese people necessarily operating in other parts of the world. So you need that local talent, that local know-how, local language, which is very important. So the way we're now set up, it used to be that George and I were co-CEOs, and we still are, but we didn't really have anybody right under us. We had no chief operating officers right under us. So today we have two co-chief operating officers who basically focus on the day-to-day. George and I focus much more today on bringing in new ideas, helping bring in opportunities for investment, acquisitions like we acquired recently Global Atlantic, which is a life and annuity business that brought in about $92 billion of permanent capital coming in. Those kinds of things we will focus on and work very closely with the people that are running and involved in the day-to-day business. So yes, it has changed a lot.
That's interesting. I want to take the lens now out further. Having started at KKR, let's talk about globalization generally for a moment. You started the KKR Global Institute. General Petraeus is your partner in charge of that. What did you have in mind of thinking about globalization in that way?
Well, it's interesting. Today, there are people that say globalization has really hurt a lot of people. And there are other people that say globalization has brought extraordinary benefits to the company. Inequality around the world comes to mind when I think about what is happening because of globalization, and I think about allowing hundreds of millions of people to escape poverty because of globalization. But it's also increased inequality as well. Not only inequality of wealth, but inequality of opportunity, as many things have moved from developed countries to the underdeveloped countries or developing countries. I think as a result of that, that has one of the things that has triggered the idea that maybe globalization is really bad. I don't happen to think it is bad, but you cannot forget about your employees at home. So I think what I would say is we risk making a mistake if we treat globalization as a unmitigated disaster, and that it has to be undone. I don't agree with that. I don't think that's what we do. But we are going to avoid the extreme outcome, and we need some recalibration is in order to make sure that we don't go too far to one extreme or the other. So to your question about David Petraeus and bringing him in, what we wanted to do was get closer to governments around the world to understand what those governments needed, wanted, and what kind of regulation might be coming down the road in various countries. Dave and his team, and they team with our macro and asset allocation team, and they also team with our ESG team under Ken Melman. And so by working together, and this is so important today. It used to be you could just look at a company and say, that's fine, it's a good company, let's go make an investment. You can't do that anymore. You need to understand what are the risks in country X? What are the opportunities in country X? Secondly, ESG. Is the company in violation on supply chain and on their workers? Are they in violation on climate control and pollution here, and lots of other things that are so important when you're going to make an investment. I don't think, Glenn, today that anybody can be a good investor or have a world-class company if you don't have ESG embedded in your thinking, embedded in the DNA of the company. So we look at the whole picture today. When we've made mistakes, and God knows we've made enough mistakes over the years, most of the mistakes were made because we didn't focus enough on the macro side of an industry. We were strictly focused too much on the micro, on the company itself, and forgot about what might affect it. So that's why macro comes in today. So for example, gas and oil prices are very important. Where do we think those are going to go? As opposed to say, well, it's a good company and they're humming along just fine. And all of a sudden gas prices fall out of bed or go up, depends on which side you're on, and you have a bad investment. So you need today to have all of those things. One last point I would make, I don't think anyone today can be a good investor unless you're curious. You have to be curious about a lot of things. And it's not just finding a company and looking at it. You've got to know where the puck is going. You can't just look down and say, I see the puck here in hockey parlance, but you have to say, okay, where is it going? And what could we do with this business to make it a better business? And if you have a global lens on, you can see, wow, there's about 5 countries where we can go, and this is perfect for what the country needs, and we can expand that business dramatically by being part of that country's fabric.
Let me take that Wayne Gretzky, Henry Kravis puck analogy and press you a little bit. So when the Chazen Institute was founded, the early 1990s were a time when everybody was basically a champion for globalization. It's just terrific. Economists were there, business executives like yourself, government leaders, and so on. Now, as you said quite correctly, the reception is a little bit more chilly. And as an economist, I've always thought part of that is we were taking globalization rules and saying the economy just has to adjust, rather than focusing, as you rightly said, on people who've been left behind. There's a lot of public policy in there, but what about business leaders? Do business leaders have a responsibility for Americans who may have been left behind by trends in globalization? And if so, what could they do?
Well, without a doubt, I think business leaders do have a responsibility there. I think it's not only globalization that is causing some of the problem. It's also technology is causing a maybe even a bigger problem than what globalization might bring to the table. So I think it's very important that executives think about innovation. They think about what other opportunities can we create to bring people along here, to give them more opportunities. Yes, if their job is about to be obsolete because of technology or because they outsourced the manufacturing or a particular service, well, I think it's the obligation of that company then to figure out, okay, what else can we do? And I think it's just smart business to do that. Now, one of the things that we've done recently, and it was headed by one of my partners, Pete Stavros, which I think is a wonderful concept, and that is to give stock to workers on the floor, on the production floor, and make sure they feel like they're an owner of the company. Believe me, when they become an owner of the company, they're going to think differently about it. They're going to work differently, and they're going to say, wow, this is our company, as opposed to thinking of themselves as being robotic. And I got this job and I put this peg in this hole, and that's all I ever do there. They'll also tell you, I think you'll get better ideas from them on how can you improve the business. You know, they're on the floor. They're every day. They're seeing ideas, and they'll come forward if they say, hey, this is going to matter. So I think it's innovation is important, bringing the workers along and giving them opportunities to share in the upside. You're not taking anything away from anybody at the top. You're not taking anything away from the shareholders. In fact, if the worker becomes more productive, more innovative, they're going to be better for the company in the long run. So we think this ownership, which is a fairly new concept in private equity, really has enormous benefits going forward here. I would say, one other thing is, education. To me, if we're going to make sure people are not left behind, I think it's the responsibility, not the federal government, but I think it's also the private sector to play a very important role in educating the workforce and educating people so that they can get a reasonable job and keep that reasonable job and grow from there. So I think it's very important that education is important. Now, obviously, with certain I call them border clashes, whether it be China, U.S., China, India, you're going to see certain supply chains will move from those countries. And I see today already, and I hear a lot of companies saying, as you probably do too, we need to have a more mobile supply chain, and it needs to be closer to our service or our manufacturing, of the end product, and not just rely on China, because when China shuts down for whatever reason, you're out of luck. And so you can't have that. So I think you're going to see, I'm not saying everything comes back to the US. I know certain people would like to see that. I don't think that's realistic. You'll see some come back to the US, but I think you're going to see, if you have an educated workforce in America or in Europe, you're going to see more opportunities for that educated workforce as supply chains are moving more toward the manufacturing capability.
Interesting. I want to talk a little bit about COVID and your thinking. We're doing this by Zoom because obviously we're still in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic, and it's a pandemic that caught most of us probably by surprise. What's the next big event, whether it's political, health, economic, that occupies your thoughts? None of us knows what's next in terms of a big thing, but what are the kinds of things that you worry about?
Well, first of all, when COVID hit, it's funny. We shut down about the 15th of March, all our offices. And I'm at home and I said, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I didn't know much about Zoom at the time and certainly hadn't used it. And I thought, well, I guess I can clean a closet. Well, I never quite got to that closet. It's still in the same condition it was. And I found that all of us have been, for this past 12 months, probably busier than ever, probably more productive than ever, because you don't have to be on a plane going places. And I just think about, every morning I get up, I'm talking to China, or I'm talking to Japan, or I'm talking to Europe. And, I couldn't do that otherwise. You got to be on a plane, you got to go there. Now, I'm not saying we're going to have Zoom and that's going to be replacing all face-to-face. I hope it doesn't. I don't think that it will. But we've been very focused on our people. We set up relief effort and put $50 million from the employees at KKR into a fund to be used for COVID. Now, what is next? Okay, first of all, I think we've all learned a lot from this 12-month lockdown that we've had, or basic lockdown. And I think what we've seen is that e-commerce and digital, the digital era, digitalization, has clearly played a more important role than ever. I don't see that changing. If anything, I see that continuing to grow. Nesting is a very important part now. You look at where what has been bought at Walmart or Home Depot or wherever it is. Well, revenue went up in all those places because people were taking a look at their home as they were spending much more time at home and said, well, we need to redo our kitchen, or we need new windows, or whatever it happens to be. I think going forward, you're going to see more and more people for a while. I don't know how long, but for certainly a decent period of time, who say, I want to spend more time at home. I want to spend, I'm not going to go out to restaurants quite as much as I did in the past. And so therefore, anything that has to do with nesting. I think ESG plays a very important part in infrastructure. You've seen that. It's a priority for the Biden administration. And it's needed in our country. Our infrastructure has been decaying. So I think with COVID and just thinking through where we are, I think you're going to see more focus on ESG issues and infrastructure clearly. So what do I worry about? Okay, things I worry about. We did not know COVID was coming. Very few people knew COVID was coming. But what we did know is that we had gone about 125 or so months of uninterrupted growth, which I believe, and you're an economist, is the longest period of time of growth of GDP in the US since 1900. We knew something would stop it. We didn't know what, and we certainly had never heard of COVID, but we were prepared because we said, okay, we missed part of the global financial crisis. We got through it just fine. But had we been better prepared, we'd have jumped in with both feet right at the beginning of the global financial crisis and said, this too will pass. Let's buy everything that we possibly can. And we did okay, but we didn't do as much as George and I had hoped we'd be able to do. We were ready this time. And when COVID hit, the only unfortunate thing was we had our targets of what we want, where we wanted to go put money and with whom, whether it be a credit instrument, could be equity, it could be real estate, whatever. So we were ready to go and we pounced. Unfortunately for us, great for the country, Jay Powell moved extremely quickly, and he, put the money out like, no tomorrow, and that was smart. And except your spreads, shrunk, immediately. And so there went some of our opportunities in credit. Now, not all of them, but it certainly changed a lot. We were able to put money to work in the equity market. We're not stock pickers, so we take long-term positions. We were able to do that. Today, I'm worried about worsening geopolitical tensions. I am concerned, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, what happens with China and India, as we've seen there, and then India's retaliation. They say, okay, fine, we're going to get rid of every Chinese app. We don't want them in our country. So TikTok and others were at least banned for the time being. You see frictions with China and other major economic powers, not only the U.S., but Japan and Australia, in addition to India, obviously. So I worry about those. Today we worry about what are the policy decisions. It used to be that economic policy would often drive geopolitical policy, and I think it's the opposite today. I think geopolitical policy today is starting to drive economic policy, more than it probably should. I hope certainly the great scholar at Harvard, Graham Allison, who wrote a wonderful book a while ago on Destined for War, and his argument that you look back over history, great powers as they start to build up, you could end up in a war. I'm hoping that calmer heads will prevail here, and that we're not going to end up, but that we can figure out a way to coexist with China, with both of us still, going for in a competitive way for market share, et cetera. And so I'm hoping that it'll be really more of a great power competition in the best sense, as opposed to pulling out the guns and figuring out, okay, this is what we're going to do to each other, because nobody wins in that case. So I am very worried, probably most importantly, about geopolitical issues around the world.
Well, I hope you're right, and we avoid Graham Allison's Thucydides trap. But at least you've got General Petraeus to command forces, so I think you'll be safe. I want to go to Colombia and the Chazen Institute, because of course we're having this conference for the 30th anniversary of the Chazen Institute's trying to weave globalization through the thread of Columbia Business School. Two questions for you. Part one, what should business schools be doing? You've touched on a number of things of how you search for global opportunity, your philosophy for managing a global organization. In what way should business schools be weaving globalization through what we do?
Well, one of the things that I think is critical, and fortunately, Columbia has done a reasonably good job, and that's to make sure you're an international business school. The idea that you're based in New York, so therefore, 90% of your students will be U.S. based. That's a bad thing to do. The world is we are international, and so the thing that's important. Second thing I think business schools should do is to focus on diversity and inclusion, not only with backgrounds, but race, ethnicity, and thought. And those are three things that I like to talk to our people at KKR about. that we will be much better at our business if we think broadly, inclusively, and we learn from each other. So one of the things that I think is important in a business school today, or any school for that matter, is to listen to other people's points of view, to learn to understand that it doesn't have to be just your way, that maybe if you really would open your mind and you would listen, that maybe we're closer to each other than most people think here. And maybe we'll learn from each other, and maybe we'll both get stronger, as opposed to some colleges and universities. If you don't agree with me, I don't want you on campus. That's a very dangerous thing. So business schools today can play a very important role in making sure that you have a broad-gauged person coming out of the school prepared to take care of geopolitical issues, take care of healthcare issues, take care of just human issues that come up, and don't just say, hey, I can answer the question and I know the following equation, or I know exactly what needs to be done with this company to make it a better marketing company or whatever. That's all important, but there's much more today to business than just that. I often am amazed at the quality of CEOs in Europe. And one of the reasons I say that is because when I talk to them, they're very broad gauged. They're extremely well educated. They're interested in music. They're interested in the arts. They're interested in history. They're interested in literature. And it's not just narrowly focused. And I unfortunately think too many people in business today are much too narrow in their thinking. And I said earlier that to be a good investor, you need to be curious. Well, I would also say the same thing. To be a good executive, you need to be curious. You need to know where the future is. Where is the puck going, in Gretzky terminology? And you will be a much better leader, and you will be and your company will be much further ahead than if you're looking. And the one thing that I say, and I think it's really important for students to understand this, but I see so many people in pension funds and elsewhere that I talk to, and they don't necessarily get this. And that is, a corporation is a living organ. It's evolving. And I like to say, think of this company, whatever company it is, like a movie. And it is a series of still photographs put together, which is what a movie is. And too many people look at the photograph and they don't see the train's already left. And they're focusing at the photograph. Well, it comes back the same thing with the puck analogy. If you're looking at where it is today, you're going to miss a lot of opportunity. Well, it's the same thing that you need to teach students to understand that, hey, there's a lot of way to get to the goal. And it's not just one way. And open your mind. History repeats itself. Understand history. Make sure you're aware of it. So those are some of the thoughts.
I want to turn, if I might, to philanthropy, because we've talked a lot about how you approach investing, how you approach leading people in the private sector in your organization. You've been a great philanthropic investor. I know that personally. And so how do you approach that? When you at KKR, if you're buying a company, you're trying to improve operations, to change strategy, to increase productivity, and create value for yourself and your investors. How do you approach philanthropy in that regard?
Well, it's a great question, Glenn. There are a couple ways. Number one, about 30 years ago, I called David Rockefeller, who I thought was probably the best philanthropist that I knew, certainly. And I said, David, would you have lunch with me? He said, absolutely. So we had lunch. And I said, look, I'm fairly young. I'm just starting to make some money. But I want to understand your philosophy of how to make a difference in your philanthropic endeavors. And he gave me a piece of advice that I thought was just wonderful, and I often recite it, and that is that don't just write a check, get involved. And that can mean a lot of things. Too many people just write a check and Unfortunately, not enough large checks are being written, but as we know, but they don't really get involved. And so, like our business at KKR, we find a business and we try to figure out how can we make this business a better business, one, and two, how can we grow the business? So I like to find organizations where if I make a large donation to them and get involved, will it make a real difference? Do they have the pathway for real growth? Or the other side, I'll get involved where I may become chairman of the board, which I've done on a number of occasions of not-for-profits, where I think I can improve the operation. I can make it a better business or organization than it maybe is today. My latest endeavor is Sponsors for Educational Opportunity, where we take in our scholars program students who come from household incomes of under $35,000. And they asked me to chair the board, and I was not on the board at the time. They asked me would I come in and be chairman, and I thought about it, and I said I think I can make a real difference here, and I can grow the business, grow what they're doing. They've been around at that point for about 51 years, and yet it was a secret. Very few people knew about it. So I wanted to get involved with it because I thought I can make a difference. And the first thing I did in our very first board meeting, I said, this program is so good. 90% of our students graduate from college, and compared to people we would compare ourselves to, 20% of minority students who go to college, 20% graduate in about 8 years. We were 90% in roughly 6 years. And I said, we can expand this program. So I doubled the number of incoming students from 125 in New York to 270. Today, we started out our budget, my first year was $7 million. Today, our budget is $34 million. And we're expanding the program. And we're working on a program, which is the one good thing actually has come out of COVID, because we had to go online, that we may have stumbled onto an opportunity to take SEO national. Where we can have basically a hybrid program of part online and part offline, mainly online, and we can have this in large cities across the country. So that's an example where I said I can really get involved. It's just like our business at KKR. We're industry focused. We're broken up by industry specialization, and we expect our people in each industry to understand as much about the industry as you possibly can, and then find the companies where we can actually help them grow, or we can turn a company around. Well, philanthropy is exactly the same thing in my view. You want to find an organization that needs your money, that really isn't going to waste it. And one of the things I like to look at, what is the amount of money that goes to overhead, goes to raising money, goes to a staff and so forth. And if it's too high, I'm probably not going to have any interest. I want money to go into the bloodstream where it's really getting to the people who can be helped. So that's really the way I look at philanthropy. And there are probably 3 areas where we have focused our efforts. Marie-José and I have focused in the arts, in science, and medicine, and then in education. And those really have been the 3 areas, and we try to focus on that. And yes, we'll write checks for friends that are raising some money for another type of organization, but that's not where our large dollars and our large focus is today.
Thanks so much, Henry. From the puck to the bloodstream, thanks so much for taking the time to be with this conference today and for your leadership in so many things. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Great, always great being with you, and I appreciate your asking me to have this conversation with you.
Globalization, like all dynamic phenomena, will change, that we know. But the sun isn't setting and isn't going to set on globalization. And at the Chazen Institute, we want to keep following, intellectually speaking, that sun. We've heard a lot of great perspectives in this conference today, much to think about and much to do. I don't necessarily know all the answers, but I get a feeling we had great questions. And I do know that the Chazen Institute and our community, everybody participating in this conference, will be a leader in the discussion of globalization's future and, importantly, its implications for business and our lives in society. Some big thanks for giving us ideas, our great speakers and Chazen senior scholars. We heard not only specifics, but the importance of context, of history, of politics, and even my own favorite subject, economics. For putting us together, the first agency that stood up this show, the Columbia Global Center is our partner, and the incredible Chazen Institute team that really brought this together. For imagining this, Jerry Chazen once again, for vision and for support. And you, for joining us, for participating in this. All registrants will receive a follow-up email containing a link to the conference and some other information. And my ask is, let's keep the conversation going. And now, thank you. I bid you good afternoon, good evening, good wee hours, depending on when and where you started with us. Thank you very much.